They laughed when a homeless veteran Navy SEAL spent his last dollar on a ruined watermill deep in the Minnesota forest. But his German shepherd, Kepler, refused to leave the porch, as if the old house had already chosen them. Behind the moss-covered walls, 5 feet of the building seemed to exist on paper but nowhere inside the rooms. Then the ancient water wheel turned, a hidden mechanism clicked, and a sealed passage opened after nearly 30 years. What Alden found inside was worth far more than money, and soon a developer offered him $1 million to walk away. But when the storm came, Alden would have to choose between saving the secret, saving the watermill, or saving the men who wanted it gone. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and please like this video and subscribe to K9 Navy SEAL Stories. 3 years after leaving the Navy SEALs, Alden Whitaker found a white envelope taped to the front door of his rented house. He noticed it before he noticed the new for sale sign standing crooked at the end of the gravel drive. At 43, Alden still carried himself with the quiet economy of a man who had learned that wasted movement could become danger. He stood 6'1", broad through the shoulders, his body still hard and balanced from years of special operations training. Not the exaggerated bulk of a bodybuilder, but practical muscle built for endurance, lifting, climbing, and surviving long after comfort had disappeared. His face had the same weathered restraint, angular features, a defined jaw beneath short natural stubble, moderate cheekbones, a straight nose, a slightly broad forehead, and thick dark brown brows over deep blue-gray eyes that seemed to measure a room before allowing him to belong in it. Years outdoors had left his skin deeply tanned and a little rough, with fine lines around the eyes. His dark brown hair remained cut short in the old military habit, silver, arriving early at both temples. He wore what had become almost a civilian uniform, an old but sturdy olive green field jacket, over a red and deep navy plaid flannel shirt, dark green cargo pants, worn brown leather boots, and an old military field watch strapped to his left wrist. Nothing about him asked for attention. The envelope did. Alden removed it carefully. The property had been sold. He had 72 hours to leave. He read the notice once, then again. There was no outburst, no fist against the wall, no angry phone call. He simply folded the paper along its original crease and slipped it inside his jacket. He had received worse news in places without windows. That should have made this easier. It did not. Inside the small house, 6 cardboard boxes sat against the living room wall. Alden stopped when he saw them. That was the part he had not expected to hurt. 43 years of life. Years of service. 3 difficult years trying to become an ordinary civilian, and everything he still considered important could apparently fit into 6 boxes. Tools, a few worn books, kitchen things, documents, several pieces of clothing he rarely wore, 1 box of photographs he had avoided opening for nearly 2 years. And then there was Kepler. The 7-year-old German shepherd lay beside the boxes, watching Alden with the patient concentration of a working dog who had long ago learned the difference between noise and trouble. Kepler was a black and tan working-line male, medium-sized rather than oversized, with a lean athletic frame and compact muscles beneath a dense short to medium coat. A clear black saddle covered most of his back. His muzzle was dark, while warm tan marked his chest, legs, and both sides of his face. His triangular ears stood naturally upright, except that the edge of the right one bore a small old tear. Deep amber brown eyes gave him an expression that was intelligent without being human-like, alert, observant, always collecting information. A faded dark olive working dog harness rested across his shoulders. Years earlier, Kepler had worked beside Alden. Now he was the last living thing in Alden's life that never demanded an explanation for the man he had become. By evening, the house sounded different. Empty rooms always did. Footsteps echoed farther. The refrigerator seemed louder. Even the pipes complained with surprising confidence. Alden sat on the bare floor, his back against the wall. Kepler settled beside him. "The good news," Alden said, "is we're about to save a lot of money on rent." Kepler lifted his head. "The bad news is the roof apparently goes with it." One ear shifted. For a second, Alden almost smiled. Then Kepler slowly lowered his head onto Alden's knee. The weight was gentle. It broke through him more effectively than the eviction notice had. Alden rested one rough hand between the dog's ears. He could sleep in his pickup. He had slept in worse places. That was not what bothered him. Kepler had followed him through years of noise, cold, waiting, movement, injuries, strange rooms, temporary quarters, and long silences after the uniform came off. Alden had always believed the dog's later years would be different. A porch, soft ground, morning sunlight, a place where Kepler could grow old without being moved every few months. Instead, Alden had 3 days to pack again. "Sorry, buddy," Kepler's eyes remained closed. That somehow made it worse. The next morning, Alden drove into North Haven for Kepler's veterinary appointment. The little northern Minnesota town looked as though it had been built entirely from practical necessities. A diner, a hardware store, a gas station, a brick library, a church steeple, and houses with stacks of split firewood already prepared for winter. Forest crowded close behind everything. The veterinary clinic stood near the edge of town in a low cedar-sided building. The veterinarian was a compact woman in her late 50s, with short iron gray hair, fair skin, calm brown eyes, and the efficient manner of someone who had spent decades handling nervous animals and even more nervous owners. She examined Kepler's hind legs, flexed the joints gently, then watched him walk across the room. "Nothing alarming," she said. "He's 7. He's worked hard. Cold mornings are starting to collect their payment." Kepler looked at her. The veterinarian smiled. "Yes, I know, slander." Alden's mouth moved slightly, almost a smile. She recommended regular movement on soft ground, fewer slick floors, warmth during the Minnesota winter, minimal unnecessary stair climbing, and a quieter environment if possible. "Dogs like him get very good at staying alert," she said. "Sometimes they forget they're allowed to stop." Alden looked down at Kepler. He understood that sentence a little too well. He nodded as though quiet ground and a permanent home were ordinary things he could pick up on his way outside. While waiting to pay, Alden stopped beside a corkboard crowded with local advertisements: firewood, a used snowmobile, a canoe that mostly floated, snowplowing, a church supper. Then he saw a yellowed sheet of paper partly hidden behind a flyer. At the top was a small photograph, a crooked wooden house deep in the forest, a waterfall rising behind it, and beside one wall a huge wooden water wheel. Underneath were 3 lines: "Old watermill home, $1 must be occupied, must not be demolished." Alden stared at it, then gave a quiet laugh. "Finally," he said to Kepler, "real estate in our price range." He started toward the counter. The leash tightened. Alden stopped. Kepler had not followed. The German shepherd stood directly beneath the notice. He lifted his nose toward the paper, sniffed once, then stared at the tiny photograph. "Come on." Kepler glanced back at Alden, then returned his attention to the picture. Alden gave the harness a light, familiar pull. Kepler took one step, stopped, looked back at the photograph again. Alden's expression changed. This was not ordinary stubbornness. Kepler had always been disciplined. When he hesitated, there was usually a reason. A scent, a vibration, movement in the distance, something Alden had not yet noticed. But this was a photograph, nothing more. Alden stepped closer. The mill looked terrible. The roof sagged, moss covered half of it. One side of the porch leaned visibly downward. The enormous wheel appeared old enough to have known better centuries. He took out his phone and photographed the telephone number. Curiosity, he told himself, not hope. Hope had terrible judgment. By the time Alden reached his pickup, he had already decided not to call. By the time he put the key into the ignition, he had changed his mind. The strange part wasn't the $1 house. It was Kepler. The dog sat calmly in the passenger seat now, looking through the windshield as though nothing unusual had happened. Alden had trusted Kepler's attention in circumstances where overlooking a detail could cost lives. The animal rarely spent that attention without reason. Sometimes Alden knew. Instinct didn't arrive like thunder. Sometimes it simply refused to walk past a piece of paper. And against every sensible instinct of his own, Alden dialed the number. The woman who answered introduced herself as Margaret Bellwether. Maggie, she corrected before Alden could say Mrs. Bellwether. She was 78 and had spent nearly 40 years working in the county records office before retirement. Even through the phone, Alden could hear that age had softened her voice without weakening it. She spoke patiently and with a dry precision that suggested she had spent most of her life dealing with people who believed arguing could change documents. Alden skipped the pleasantry. Is the $1 price missing a few zeros? No. Back taxes? No. Lien? No. Structural condemnation? No. Alden leaned against the truck. Kepler sat beside his boots. So where's the trap? A small laugh came through the phone. The last man asked the same thing, and I didn't sell it to him. Alden frowned. You had somebody offering more than $1? Several. And you turned them down? Yes. Why? Maggie paused. Not theatrically, just long enough to choose her words. Because the man who left it didn't ask me to find the person with the most money. What did he ask you to find? The right person. Alden closed his eyes. He hated riddles almost as much as inspirational wall signs. And what makes somebody the right person? This time her voice softened. Someone who needs a place to stay more than he needs something to own. Alden nearly ended the call. He did not want charity. He did not want to be studied. He certainly did not want some dead stranger deciding what kind of man deserved a house. Then Kepler quietly placed one paw over the toe of Alden's worn brown boot. Alden looked down. "What condition is it in?" There was another pause. "Rough," Maggie answered, "but standing." "How rough?" "You should come see it." Alden realized only much later that he had never asked how much land came with the house. That afternoon, his pickup carried him deep into White Cedar Range. The maintained road became gravel. The gravel became two faded tire tracks winding through pine, cedar, spruce, and white-barked birch. The final 8 miles barely deserved to be called a road. Fern crowded the edges. Gray granite rose from the earth. Moss covered fallen logs and boulders in thick green blankets. Golden afternoon light poured between the trees. Kepler sat upright, increasingly attentive but not anxious. Then Alden heard water. At first, it was little more than a low pressure beneath the truck's engine. A minute later, it became a roar. The forest opened. Alden slowed. A waterfall spilled in white ribbons over dark granite, breaking into mist before gathering again in a rushing stream, and beneath it stood the watermill. For several seconds, Alden forgot about the eviction notice. The old house seemed to have grown out of the forest. Weathered gray-brown cedar boards covered walls bent slightly by decades of northern winters. Moss occupied broad sections of the steep roof. Vines crept over the stone foundation. One corner of the narrow porch sagged. The railing leaned. Off-white paint peeled from several window frames. A small old lantern hung beside the front door, and along the left side of the house stood the wheel. It was enormous, dark with age, nearly as tall as the lower roofline. A wooden flume carried part of the stream toward it, spilling water over the upper paddles. The wheel turned reluctantly. Creak, it stopped, then moved another few inches. Creak. Alden shut off the truck. Kepler stared through the windshield. Maggie Bellwether waited beside the porch. In person, she was small, about 5'4", with a slim frame and a slight natural curve to her back that age had given her without taking away her independence. Her long oval face carried deep lines around her mouth and pale blue eyes, but those eyes remained sharp and surprisingly bright. Silver-white hair was gathered neatly into a low bun. She wore a weathered sage-green canvas barn jacket over a cream-knit cardigan and an ivory blouse, dark brown straight-leg trousers, brown leather walking shoes, and held a small brass key ring in one hand. She looked less like a woman selling a house than someone guarding one. Several North Haven residents had gathered farther up the path. Small towns rarely needed invitations to unusual events. One man stood ahead of the others. Calvin Rusk was 52, around 6 feet tall, solidly built, and slightly heavier through the torso than Alden. Confidence showed in the way he planted his boots and occupied space without needing permission. He had a square face, broad jaw, slightly large nose, brown-gray eyes, and neatly combed brown hair threaded with gray. He was clean-shaven. A dark navy waxed field coat covered a light blue Oxford shirt. He wore charcoal-work chinos, dark brown leather outdoor boots, and a simple steel watch. Calvin owned a local development company and had the polished ease of a man accustomed to negotiation. His smile was pleasant enough to be polite and amused enough to be irritating. "You're actually thinking about buying it?" he asked. Alden studied the building. "I'm still deciding if it qualifies as a house." A few people chuckled. Calvin gestured toward the wheel. "I've seen people throw money down the drain. Never seen anyone buy the drain." The laughter grew. Alden felt no need to answer. Mockery from strangers was cheap. Maggie did not laugh. She extended the key. "Look inside first, the interior sim." Yes, the floor creaked. One ceiling section bore an old water stain. Cold air leaked through a window frame, but the structure itself felt remarkably solid. The cedar walls were unusually thick. Cabinets sat perfectly square despite their age. Shelves had been built into tiny spaces most carpenters would have wasted. Windows were positioned to catch sunlight filtered through the forest and reflected from moving water. Alden ran his fingers along a cabinet joint. Hand-cut, precise. Whoever had built this place had thought about every inch. Someone had cared. That almost made Alden dislike it. Things built with care were harder to walk away from, and walking away had become something he understood. He stepped back outside. The sensible answer was obvious. The roof needed work. The porch needed work. The water system needed work. Probably everything else needed work too. Alden had almost no money. He did not need another mission. He turned toward the pickup. Kepler. The German shepherd did not follow. He was standing beneath the water wheel, nose near the moss-covered stone foundation. Kepler. The dog sniffed again, then climbed the uneven porch steps. He walked to the door, turned once, and lay down. Alden stopped. "Come." Kepler looked toward him, then lowered his head onto his front paws. Not guarding, not waiting for instructions. Resting. His amber eyes slowly closed. Alden stared. In unfamiliar places, Kepler always chose a position where he could monitor entrances, even after retirement. Motels, temporary rooms, cabins, someone else's home. One ear always seemed assigned to the door. But here, surrounded by strangers, beneath the roar of a waterfall in a forest he had never visited, Kepler simply went to sleep. Maggie noticed. She said nothing. Alden walked toward the porch. He crouched beside Kepler and placed a hand against the dog's shoulder. Loose muscles, slow breathing, no tension. The veterinarian's words returned. Sometimes they forget they're allowed to stop. Alden swallowed. He looked at the moss-covered roof, the leaning railing, the old wheel groaning beside the house. Then back at the dog who, for the first time in months, had stopped watching the exit. "How much?" Alden asked. Someone laughed. Maggie did not. $1. Alden opened his wallet, his driver's license, 2 receipts, a folded photograph, and a single dollar bill. He stared at it. $1 could buy coffee, maybe a bottle of water. It could not buy security, could not buy a future, could not make a tired man whole again. Still, Alden removed it. He placed the bill in Maggie's hand. Another laugh came from behind Calvin. Someone muttered that the veteran had lost his mind. Alden heard it. He let it pass. Maggie folded the dollar once and placed an old brass key into his palm. Her thin fingers closed his around it. Mr. North had a saying. Alden looked at her. What saying? Sometimes a house knows who needs it before the person knows he needs a house. Alden stared at her for several seconds. I'm going to pretend you didn't say that. A tiny smile appeared on Maggie's face. I thought you might. He disliked the sentence because it sounded sentimental. Worse, it sounded like hope. And hope, Alden had learned, became dangerous when people mistook it for evidence. By sunset, Maggie and the curious residents had left. Calvin's truck was the last to disappear between the trees. Alden carried his sleeping bag inside. There was almost no furniture worth using, but the little black cast-iron stove worked after some persuasion. He made a small fire. For the first time in days, he removed his olive field jacket and hung it over the back of a chair. Kepler slept nearby. The waterfall filled the house with a constant low roar. Beyond the wall, the wheel moved at irregular intervals. Creak. Silence. Creak. Alden lay on the sleeping bag staring into darkness. He had bought a house for $1. Technically, the porch might collapse. The roof needed repair. There was probably a family of mice with stronger legal rights than his. He should have been terrified by the stupidity of it. Instead, beneath the exhaustion, something quieter had appeared. Not happiness. He was not ready to call it that. Maybe relief. Maybe simply the absence of immediate panic. For tonight, no landlord could tape another notice to the door. For tonight, Kepler was asleep. That was enough. Eventually, Alden closed his eyes. Sometime deep in the night, he woke without knowing why. The stove had burned low. Pale moonlight stretched across the wooden floor. Kepler was standing. The dog was no longer relaxed. His head was high, ears forward, amber eyes fixed on the cedar wall nearest the water wheel. Alden pushed himself upright. Kepler crossed the room silently, stopped, then pressed his right ear close to the old wood. Alden listened. Outside, the waterfall continued to thunder. Then the wheel moved, creak. One slow turn. Kepler remained perfectly still. Another turn, creak. Alden rose from the sleeping bag, and somewhere behind the cedar wall, too faint to belong to the waterfall, came a single sound. Click. By daylight, the north wall looked disappointingly ordinary. Alden Cross Whitaker spent nearly 40 minutes inspecting it from both sides. He ran his fingers along the cedar boards, checked the base trim, pressed against every section that looked even slightly uneven. He examined the exterior from beneath the old water wheel, then returned inside and used the handle of a screwdriver to tap along the wall. Solid, solid, solid. Nothing shifted. No hidden seam appeared. No obvious hollow space answered him. At 43, Alden had learned to distrust explanations that required mystery when age and physics would do. Old wood moved. Iron contracted in cold air. Water pressure changed. A nearly forgotten mill built beside a waterfall could produce enough strange sounds to keep an imaginative man awake for years. He had more immediate problems. The roof leaked above the kitchen. The porch's outer corner had dropped nearly 2 inches. A section of the wooden flume feeding the water wheel had split along the grain. The east window frame allowed enough cold air inside to move the curtain. 2 stones in the lower foundation had begun to separate, and one support post beneath the porch had the structural integrity of wet bread. Alden stood in the yard with both hands on his hips. Kepler sat beside him. The 7-year-old German shepherd studied the house with far less judgment. "Your inspection report?" Alden asked. Kepler looked toward the woods. "Helpful." Alden began with the porch support. That was how he had approached problems for most of his adult life. Not with optimism, with priority. Find the thing most likely to kill someone. Deal with that first. Everything else could wait. He unloaded his old tools from the pickup and spread them across a scrap of plywood beneath the porch roof. Some had belonged to his father. Others he had bought while trying to keep his failed repair business alive. A few carried small burns, rust marks, or names scratched into their handles by men no longer in his life. He did not think about any of that. Thinking slowed the hands. By noon, he had braced the porch temporarily. By evening, he had removed the worst section of rotten wood. The next morning, he drove into North Haven looking for work. He found it faster than Dignity would have preferred. A rancher needed 40 feet of fence repaired before deer season. A marina owner had an outboard motor that had not started since June. A retired couple needed 2 fallen birches cut into firewood. The hardware store needed someone to repair a loading ramp railing. A roofing contractor needed an extra pair of hands for 2 days. Alden took almost everything. He never introduced himself as a former Navy SEAL. If someone asked what he had done before coming to town, he said, "A little of everything." It was easier that way. Hero was a word people used when they wanted the story simplified. Alden's life had never been simple. Most mornings began before sunrise. He would feed Kepler, drink coffee strong enough to remove paint, inspect whatever part of the watermill he had repaired the night before, then drive into town. He returned in late afternoon smelling of sawdust, gasoline, roofing tar, or cold air. Then he worked on his own house until the forest disappeared into blue evening. Money came in small amounts. So did progress. One week he bought a box of galvanized nails. The next, a single cedar board. Then flashing. Then a small container of exterior sealant. He learned to judge improvement by inches instead of days. A new brace beneath the porch. One window finally closing properly. A section of roof that no longer dripped into a cooking pot when it rained. A repaired hinge. A cleaned chimney. A short length of flume patched with salvaged cedar. Anyone driving past would still have seen a ruined old watermill. Alden saw a list getting shorter. Kepler seemed to notice something else entirely. The German shepherd developed his own routine. At dawn he followed the edge of the stream, moving carefully over damp earth and pine needles. His gait was still strong, but Alden noticed the first few steps after waking sometimes carried stiffness through the hindquarters. The soft forest floor helped. Within minutes, Kepler usually loosened. He would investigate the base of spruce trees, pause beside ferns, study squirrels with professional skepticism, then return to the watermill as though completing a perimeter check. In the afternoon, he slept on the porch. Not lightly, actually slept. That was new. His old habit had been to rest with one ear working even when the rest of him appeared relaxed. Here, the constant sound of water seemed to create a wall around the property. The waterfall swallowed the small cracks and snaps of the forest. Alden began noticing the same effect on himself. For years, he had disliked silence because silence made individual sounds too important. A pipe cooling, a door shutting, footsteps outside, a vehicle slowing, a dropped object 2 rooms away. At the watermill, nothing arrived alone. Every sound lived beneath the steady movement of water. It did not make Alden forget. It simply gave his mind something larger to listen to. One evening, after replacing a warped window latch, he sat on the porch with a chipped coffee mug in both hands. Kepler lay stretched beneath the weak autumn sun. The water wheel turned slowly, not smoothly. It hesitated at the same point every rotation shuddered, then continued. Alden watched it without thinking. Minutes passed, then more. Eventually, he glanced at his old military watch. 28 minutes. He had been sitting still for 28 minutes. No calculations, no debt, no old faces, no plans for where he might live next month, no instinctive inventory of exits, just cedar, water, cold coffee, and Kepler's breathing. Alden leaned back against the post. "Well," he murmured, "this is suspicious." Kepler did not bother opening his eyes. For someone who had spent years preparing for what could go wrong, peace had an unfamiliar shape. It felt almost irresponsible. That frightened Alden more than he wanted to admit. North Haven, however, had not yet decided that the watermill deserved such generosity. People talked. Of course they did. At the hardware store, Alden occasionally caught conversations ending when he approached. Someone had apparently calculated that he would abandon the property before the first heavy snow. Someone else believed the roof would collapse. A third person had started a friendly pool over whether the porch or the water wheel would fail first. Alden did not care enough to be offended. Mostly, Calvin Rusk appeared near the end of Alden's 3rd week. His dark navy waxed field coat looked almost black beneath the cedar shadows. At 52, Calvin remained solidly built, with a square face, broad jaw, brown-gray eyes, neatly combed brown hair threaded with silver, and the confidence of a man who was accustomed to having meetings end with his preferred answer. He parked near the edge of the clearing and walked toward the porch. Alden was beneath it, replacing the temporary support. "How much have you sunk into this thing?" Calvin asked. Alden kept tightening the jack. "Less than therapy." Calvin laughed. "And is it working?" Alden glanced toward the grass. Kepler was sleeping on his side in a patch of sunlight, legs loose, dark olive harness removed while he rested. Waiting on the statistics, Calvin studied the house. For once, he did not mock it. He looked toward the creek, the waterfall, the surrounding timber, then back at Alden. "I'll give you 25,000. Alden stopped working. "For what?" "The cabin, the acreage attached to it. Whatever rights came with the transfer. You offered me jokes 3 weeks ago. I've had time to reconsider." "That sounds expensive." Calvin smiled. $25,000 is a good return on one. It was. That was the problem. Alden leaned against the porch beam. "Why?" "For land. There's land everywhere." "Not with a waterfall." Alden watched him. Calvin's answer was reasonable. Too reasonable. Alden had spent enough time around negotiation to know when a man had given the true answer without giving the whole answer. "No." Calvin studied him for another second. "You should think about it." "I did. That fast?" "I've had practice." Calvin left without irritation. That bothered Alden more than anger would have. A desperate buyer pushed. A patient buyer believed time was on his side. 2 weeks later, Calvin returned. $40,000. No explanation beyond the same pleasant assurance that Alden could walk away with more money than he had seen in months. Alden declined again. This time, after Calvin's truck disappeared between the trees, Alden remained standing near the road. Kepler came from the porch and stopped beside him. $40,000. Enough to clear a painful portion of his debt. Enough to move somewhere easier. Enough to stop calculating which repairs could wait. Enough to make the watermill someone else's problem. Alden looked back at the sagging house, then at Kepler. The dog was staring at him. Not the road, not the truck, him. Alden had no idea what Kepler read in a human body. Breathing, posture, scent, tension. But the dog had been reading his for years. "You've got an opinion." Kepler stepped closer and leaned one shoulder against Alden's leg. That was all. No grand sign, no mystical message. Just weight, warmth, presence. Alden rested his hand briefly against the dog's neck. "Yeah," he said quietly, "that's inconvenient." That night, Alden put Calvin's second offer on the little kitchen table. $40,000 written on a clean sheet of paper. Beside it sat 3 unpaid bills. For almost an hour, Alden said nothing. Kepler slept near the stove. Then a gust moved through the forest, and the old water wheel outside groaned through another uneven rotation. Alden looked at the offer, then at the patched window, the new porch brace, the coffee mug drying beside the sink. Small things, almost worthless things, yet something inside him tightened at the thought of another man tearing them apart. That realization unsettled him. He had spent years perfecting the ability to leave. Somewhere along the way, without asking permission, this broken place had begun giving him something to lose. And for Alden Cross Whitaker, that was far more frightening than having nothing. The first person in North Haven to treat him as though he were neither foolish nor interesting was Evelyn Mercer. She was 71, a widow who lived a few miles from the entrance to the forest road. Evelyn stood about 5'5" and had a naturally fuller, comfortable build. Her face was softly rounded with age, fair skin touched by faint freckles and sun marks, and warm hazel eyes that shifted between green and brown depending on the light. Silver mixed through her light brown hair, which she wore in a short bob just below the ears. She usually dressed for usefulness rather than appearance. A deep burgundy quilted barn vest over a cream and brown plaid flannel shirt, dark denim jeans, and tan leather ankle boots. Her manner was warm without being intrusive. That distinction mattered to Alden. She did not ask about medals. She did not ask what had happened to him. She did not ask why a 43-year-old man with an old military watch and the reflexes of someone who watched every doorway had ended up buying a ruined mill for $1. One morning, Alden opened the door and found a loaf of apple bread wrapped in brown paper on the porch. A note rested on top. Old houses require food for the people repairing them. No signature. Alden knew who had left it because Evelyn's farmhouse was the only occupied property close enough for someone to make the trip before dawn without turning it into an expedition. He carried the bread inside. Kepler followed. Alden cut one slice. Then another. He stood at the counter eating the second one and caught himself smiling. "Don't spread this around," he told Kepler. The dog's gaze remained fixed on the bread. Your concern for my reputation is touching. Alden did not visit Evelyn to thank her. Instead, 2 days later, he repaired the loose latch on her roadside mailbox while passing. The following morning, another half loaf appeared on his porch. Neither mentioned the exchange. It suited them. The accident happened near the end of October. Alden had been repairing the upper section of the old wooden flume. The structure carried diverted water from the stream toward the wheel, and years of moisture had turned some boards dark and soft beneath the surface. Alden tested each section before putting his weight on it. One held, the next did not. The board split lengthwise. His right boot slipped. Alden dropped from the side of the flume onto the steep mossy bank below. It was not a dramatic fall, 5 or 6 feet at most, but his left shoulder struck a granite outcrop hard enough to flash white across his vision. He rolled once and stopped against a patch of fern. For several seconds he remained still. Air first, fingers, toes, neck, nothing broken, probably. Then Kepler appeared. The German shepherd came down the slope quickly but carefully, paws finding stable earth between the rocks. He did not bark wildly. He did not jump onto Alden. Training and temperament held. Kepler positioned himself along the downhill side, blocking the steeper drop toward the stream, then touched his nose once to Alden's forearm. Alden pushed himself upright. Pain tore across his shoulder. He stopped. Kepler touched his hand again. I'm fine. Kepler remained exactly where he was. Alden took one breath, then another. I've had worse. The dog stared at him. Alden tried to stand. Kepler shifted directly into his path. Seriously? The German shepherd did not move. Alden almost laughed, but pain discouraged it. I outrank you. Kepler's amber eyes suggested that the chain of command had recently been revised. Alden managed to get to his feet. His shoulder worked, but badly. He looked up at the damaged flume. The sensible thing was to stop. He hated sensible things when they involved himself. He picked up the hammer. Kepler stepped in front of him again. Alden stared down. The dog stared back. Alden let out a slow breath. All right. He lowered the hammer. That solved the immediate problem. It did not solve transportation. Driving one-handed over the forest road seemed possible. That was exactly why Alden knew he should not do it. He stood beside the pickup with his phone in his right hand. Evelyn's number was written on the paper that had once wrapped the apple bread. Alden had put it into his contacts without admitting why. He selected the number, stopped, hung up before it rang. Kepler sat beside him. Alden tried again. Evelyn answered on the second ring. Hello? Alden looked toward the waterfall. There were sentences he had said under gunfire with less difficulty. I need help. Silence. Not shocked silence, not triumphant silence. Just enough space for the words to exist, without being embarrassed. Then Evelyn said, All right, tell me where you are. No lecture, no sympathy, no questions he could not answer. She arrived in her older SUV 20 minutes later. At the clinic, an examination showed a severe bruise and strained shoulder but no fracture or dislocation. Alden was instructed to avoid heavy lifting for several days. He accepted that instruction with the expression of a man hearing a foreign language. Evelyn drove him home. Before leaving, she pointed at him through the open truck window. If I see you on that flume tomorrow, I'll tell the dog. Alden looked at Kepler. Apparently you've built a coalition. Evelyn, smart dog. Then she drove away. That evening, Alden sat beside the stove with an ice pack over his shoulder. Kepler lay nearby. Alden looked at him. You realize this is how reputations get ruined. The German shepherd yawned. For the next few days, Alden did something unusual, very little. He handled small repairs with his right hand, sorted hardware, cleaned old tools, replaced a drawer pull, restacked firewood, things that did not require the left shoulder. Rest made him restless. Kepler seemed to enjoy his frustration. On the 4th afternoon, the dog stopped sleeping near the stove and walked into the small living room. Alden was sorting screws at the table. Kepler lowered his nose to the floor, moved several feet, stopped, sniffed again. Alden watched. The dog circled once, returning to the same board near the wall closest to the water wheel. He scratched it once with one front paw, not digging, a deliberate scrape. Then he sat. Alden waited. Kepler looked at him. What? The dog remained seated. Alden rose. His shoulder protested less than it had the previous day. He crouched beside the board. Nothing unusual showed on the surface. Wide pine plank, old nail heads. Alden pressed down, solid. Kepler lowered his nose again. Alden tapped the wood with his knuckles. A dull response. He shifted 6 inches, tapped again. Different. Not dramatically, but different. Alden's posture changed. He grabbed a flashlight, studied the seams. One end of the board appeared to have been lifted before, though whatever marks remained were decades old and nearly erased by wear. He brought over a pry bar. With the injured shoulder, leverage was awkward. He changed position, worked slowly, The board resisted, then lifted with a dry complaint. Dust rose. Alden aimed the flashlight downward. He had expected joists, dirt, possibly mice. Instead, beneath the floor was a shallow cavity lined neatly with cedar, made by hand, made intentionally. Kepler leaned closer but did not touch it. Something rested inside, wrapped in old darkened oilcloth. Alden reached down with his right hand. Metal. He drew out a rectangular box roughly the size of a large book. The hinges were brown with age, but the lid remained intact. Alden carried it to the table. Kepler followed. For a moment, Alden simply stared at it. Calvin's offer came briefly to mind. $40,000 for a property whose floor contained a deliberately hidden box. His suspicion sharpened. He opened the lid. No gold, no cash, no jewelry. Alden almost felt relieved. Inside lay a small rolled set of blueprints tied with faded cord, a thin notebook, a round brass token stamped with the image of a water wheel, and an envelope yellowed around the edges. The handwriting across the front was careful and dark. 5 words, for the one who decides to stay. Alden stopped breathing for half a second. He glanced toward the room, toward the cedar walls, toward the repaired window, then at Kepler. The dog sat beside the table, calm and attentive. Alden slid one finger beneath the envelope flap. The paper inside had been folded twice. He opened it carefully. The first line read, "If you're reading this, you've stayed long enough for the house to begin telling its story." Alden stared at the sentence, then read it again. Outside, water rolled steadily over stone. The old wheel moved through another slow rotation. Alden lowered the letter. He looked at Kepler. "You know," he said, "normal houses don't do this." Kepler tilted his head. Alden looked again at the blueprints, the brass token, and the thin notebook. He had thought the metal box was the secret. It wasn't. It was only an invitation. The letter was signed with a name Alden had seen only once before, Silas Everett North. The handwriting was neat, narrow, and deliberate, written by someone who seemed unwilling to waste either ink or space. Alden sat at the small kitchen table beneath the uneven yellow light, his injured shoulder still stiff whenever he moved too quickly. Kepler lay several feet away near the wood stove. The 7-year-old German shepherd had surrendered to sleep more easily since they had come to the watermill. His black and tan body stretched across the warm floorboards, dark saddle, rising and falling with each slow breath. One torn edge of his right ear twitched occasionally at the movement of water outside. Alden returned to the letter. Silas did not write about wealth. He did not mention the property's value. There were no instructions for buried money, hidden gold, or the kind of secret people like to imagine old houses contained. Instead, Silas wrote about peace. Shelter keeps weather from reaching the body. A home should do something more difficult. It should persuade the person inside that, for a little while, he does not need to prepare to leave. Alden stopped. Read the lines again. Then a third time despite himself. His jaw tightened. He folded the page halfway, changed his mind, and flattened it again. There was something irritating about being understood by a dead man. Alden had spent years learning how not to be trapped. He noticed exits before furniture, windows before decoration, distances before comfort. Even after leaving the service, he rarely sat with his back to an open doorway if another option existed. He had never described this to anyone as fear. It was simply preparation, useful habits, old wiring. But Silas's words bothered him because they suggested a different possibility. Maybe a man could prepare to leave so consistently that eventually he forgot how to stay. Alden glanced toward Kepler. The dog was sleeping with his side exposed to the room. No guarding posture, no head on his paws, just sleep. Alden looked away first. The rolled blueprints were more comfortable territory. Measurements could be checked. Paper did not ask personal questions. He untied the faded cord and carefully spread the first sheet across the table. The paper had browned at the edges but remained surprisingly intact. A technical drawing of the water wheel occupied most of the page. Every spoke had been numbered. The axle dimensions were recorded by hand. Water depth, blade angle, rotation rate, and flume elevation had all been marked with the obsessive precision of an engineer. A second sheet mapped the stream diversion system. A third showed the main cabin framing. The fourth made Alden sit straighter. It was a cross-section of the wall closest to the wheel. Alden took out his pencil, then his tape measure. Outside, autumn evening had already turned the forest blue. He checked the interior wall first, from the east corner to the north end, then the opposite side. He wrote the measurements directly onto a scrap of cardboard. Kepler opened one eye. "Don't start," Alden said. The eye closed again. Alden went outside with a flashlight. Mist from the waterfall hung in the cold air, catching the beam in tiny drifting points. The water wheel moved slowly beside the house. Its dark paddles accepted the stream, dipped under the weight, and rose dripping. Alden measured the exterior, once. Then again, he returned inside, measured a third time. He stared at the numbers. No. Kepler lifted his head. Alden recalculated. He accounted for wall thickness, timber framing, exterior siding, interior cedar, possible insulation. Still wrong. He walked outside again. The difference remained. 4 feet, 10 inches at one point. Almost 5 feet. Not a few inches lost to old construction. Not a measurement error. Not settling. There was physical volume between the inner wall and the outer wall that the visible layout did not explain. Alden stood in the kitchen, holding the tape measure. Somewhere beside him, nearly 5 feet of building existed, and yet there was no room occupying it. He moved to the nearest window. The recess was deep, much deeper than necessary. Alden had noticed that before, but assumed the heavy construction had been intended for northern winters. Now he understood the depth differently. He placed one hand against the cedar. Solid. Kepler came over. The German shepherd lowered his muzzle near the floor molding, moved slowly, stopped, inhaled, then shifted 2 feet to the left. Alden watched. Kepler returned to the first point. His nose hovered over the narrow gap where the wall met the pine floor. He breathed in several times. "What have you got?" The dog's ears tilted forward. Alden crouched carefully beside him. At first he felt nothing. Then he put the back of his fingers close to the trim. Air so faint he almost dismissed it. Not cold, wet air from outside, dry, and carrying the unmistakable scent of old cedar. Alden leaned closer. The airflow vanished, then returned when the water wheel outside groaned into another rotation. He sat back on his heels. A concealed space needed ventilation. Otherwise, decades of moisture beside a waterfall would have destroyed whatever was inside. That did not tell him how to enter, but it told him the 5 feet were not imaginary. Kepler looked at him. Alden scratched once beneath the dog's jaw. "Fine, 1 point for you." Kepler remained serious. "Don't let it change you." The notebook provided a different kind of clue. Unlike the blueprints, it was not a diary. Most pages contained sketches, ratios, sound measurements, weather observations, and notes on light at different hours of the day. Silas had documented the watermill almost like a laboratory. Alden found several pages under a heading, Water Rhythm, Occupant Response. Silas had recorded how changes in the flume altered the sound inside the house. At lower flow, individual forest noises remained distinct. At moderate flow, the waterfall and wheel produced a broad, continuous layer of sound. At high flow, vibration became too strong through the stone foundation. Silas appeared to be searching for a middle point. One note had been underlined twice. Continuous natural sound can soften the impact of sudden isolated noise. Another read, not treatment, not cure, simply giving the nervous system somewhere quiet to stand. Alden stared at the sentence. For a while he heard only the waterfall. Then he realized that was exactly the point. The sound was always there, yet he no longer noticed it. It formed a kind of horizon. Doors could close, branches could fall, floorboards could complain. None arrived into perfect silence. Alden thought back over the past weeks. His sleep had changed. Not dramatically. No miracle. There were still nights when old dreams came without warning. Mornings when his jaw hurt from clenching. Moments in town when a metallic crash made his body respond before his thoughts did. But the watermill gave those reactions somewhere to settle. Even Kepler seemed different. The dog's hind legs loosened faster each morning. His afternoon naps lasted longer. His attention remained sharp, but the constant need to monitor had eased. Silas had understood something. Maybe not everything, but something. Alden closed the notebook. Outside, the wheel continued to turn. For the first time, he wondered whether the strange old machine had been designed to do more than move water. Later that evening, Alden extinguished the kitchen lamp and stood alone in the dark room. Moonlight entered through the deep windows. Kepler moved to the wall again. He lowered his nose to the same narrow line near the floor. Then, unexpectedly, the German shepherd backed away, not frightened. Listening, Alden heard nothing unusual. Kepler's gaze moved upward, not toward the wall itself, toward the ceiling above it. Alden raised his flashlight. The beam crossed old cedar, dark rafters, and a section where 2 boards met so perfectly the joint almost disappeared. Then the wheel outside shifted under a heavier rush of water. The floor gave a vibration too small to see. And for less than a second, the flame of the wood stove leaned sideways, toward the wall. Alden froze. Air was being pulled somewhere, not coming from outside, moving into the missing space. Whatever Silas had built there was not simply a sealed cavity. It breathed with the house. And suddenly those missing 5 feet felt less like an architectural mistake, and more like a room waiting for the right condition to reveal itself. 2 mornings later, A dark pickup appeared at the end of the clearing. Alden recognized Calvin Rusk before the man stepped out. Calvin had stopped laughing. That alone made the visit interesting. The 52-year-old developer walked toward the porch, carrying a rigid black document tube and a folder beneath one arm. His dark navy waxed field coat was zipped halfway over the same practical light blue shirt he favored when working outside. Gray threaded more heavily through his neatly combed brown hair in the cold morning light. His square face looked businesslike rather than amused. Kepler stood beside the porch, not aggressive, watching. Calvin glanced at the dog. "Morning." Alden continued sanding a repaired window frame. "That depends. I brought something. That usually makes mornings worse." Calvin almost smiled. He opened the folder across the porch railing. Inside were color renderings. Alden stopped sanding. The first showed the waterfall. The second showed a modern lodge built farther downstream. Glass, stone, timber. 40 private cabins were distributed through the forest. A restaurant overlooked the water. Another rendering showed a wellness building and spa. A new access road curved through the trees. Calvin tapped the page. North Haven Waterfall Retreat. Alden looked at him, subtle. Names can change. The forest can't. Calvin took that without offense. He pointed to the next sheet. 40 guest cabins, main lodge, restaurant, small spa, event space, trail system. We'd improve the road. We? Investors out of Duluth and Minneapolis. My company handles local development. Alden's eyes moved over the plan. How many trees? Fewer than you think. That isn't a number. No, because we're still planning. Calvin turned another page. Approximately 80 seasonal jobs. 25 to 30 year-round positions once everything is operating. Construction work before that. Local supply contracts. Alden said nothing. Calvin continued. North Haven has lost 2 stores in 5 years. The school district's enrollment is down. Young people graduate and leave because there isn't enough work. The developer rested both hands on the railing. "I don't hate your mill, Whitaker. Could have fooled me. I thought it was a wreck. You were right. I still think it's a wreck." Alden's mouth twitched. Calvin nodded toward the house. "But that's not the point." He tapped a map. 140 acres in this block could support something the town actually needs. Alden's eyes stopped on the number. 140 acres. He had not told Calvin the size of the property. More importantly, Alden himself had never confirmed that number. The deed packet Maggie had given him contained boundary references and parcel identifiers. But he had not yet calculated the total acreage. Calvin noticed the hesitation. "You didn't know?" Alden looked at him. "You did. I've studied parcels in this watershed for years. Before I bought it? Long before." That answer was probably true, which did not make Alden trust it more. Calvin rolled the plans back into the tube. "You're thinking I'm hiding something. I think you're a developer offering $40,000 for a building you say should fall down. For the land. And now you know exactly how much land." Calvin sighed. "Because land is my business." He paused, then added, "And because I think you're confusing preservation with purpose." Alden's expression hardened slightly. Calvin gestured toward the watermill. "If you save this place, what happens? You have one old house, maybe a nice story. Maybe people drive out here and take pictures. And your version? Payroll, tax revenue, road improvements, customers for local businesses." Calvin's tone was not cruel. That was what made it difficult. He believed what he was saying. Alden had expected greed. Greed was easy to understand. Calvin offered something more complicated. A future for the town. Maybe not the future Alden wanted, but a future. "What are you asking?" Alden said. "Think before you turn me down again." "I already did." "No." Calvin shook his head. "You reacted." He looked toward the waterfall. "You're repairing a house you bought for $1. Fine. Maybe that means something to you." His brown-gray eyes returned to Alden. "But 140 acres can mean something to more people than one man and his dog." Kepler's ears shifted at the change in Calvin's voice. Alden did not answer immediately. Calvin had made one mistake, not in his numbers. In assuming Alden already knew what the land meant. Alden didn't, not yet, and that bothered him. Calvin returned to his truck. Before getting in, he turned. 40,000 is still open. Alden leaned against the porch post. "You drove 8 miles to show me drawings instead of raising the offer? I thought you should know what you're saying no to." The truck disappeared into the trees. Alden stayed outside long after the engine was gone. Kepler sat beside him. 140 acres, Alden said. The dog looked toward the stream. "Apparently we're land barons." Kepler sneezed. "That's about how I feel." The conceptual plan complicated everything. Alden had expected Calvin to be simple, a man who wanted the land because it was beautiful and could make money. That part was true. But if the resort created jobs, repaired the road, and kept younger families in North Haven, then refusing him was not automatically noble. Doing the right thing was easier when the wrong thing wore a uniform. Life after war had rarely been so considerate. That evening, Alden returned to Silas's blueprints. He examined the wheel drawing under a magnifying glass, numbers, angles, measurements. Then something he had overlooked. One spoke was marked differently, not dramatically. A small hand-drawn triangle near the hub. Alden compared it with the brass token from the floor cavity. The token showed a water wheel. One spoke on the tiny engraved wheel carried the same triangle. Alden stood. Kepler followed. Outside, the air had turned colder. Mist drifted across the stone foundation. The wheel rotated slowly. Alden used the flashlight to inspect the spokes. Most were dark, swollen with age, mottled with moss. He waited through one full rotation. Nothing. Second rotation. Then he saw it. A shallow triangular notch, nearly hidden beneath lichen. Alden stepped onto the stable stone ledge beside the axle. Kepler remained below, watching. Near the iron hub buried under moss was a small brass pin. Alden cleaned it with the edge of a screwdriver. The metal appeared surprisingly intact. He pushed. Nothing happened. He pushed harder. Still nothing. Of course. Kepler looked at the wheel. Alden did too. The marked spoke was no longer aligned with the axle. He waited. Water filled the paddles. The wheel groaned forward. The marked spoke descended. Alden watched the triangular notch approach. A small line cut into the stone housing. Closer. Closer. Aligned. He pressed the brass pin. A mechanical sound traveled through the wall. Not loud. A sequence of old metal transferring force through hidden linkage. Inside the cabin, something moved. Alden went in. Kepler followed directly behind. A section of cedar wall had separated from the surrounding boards by less than an inch. The joint was almost invisible. Alden slipped his fingers into the gap, pulled. The panel swung inward. Cool, dry air touched his face. Behind it was a narrow passage, about 2 feet wide, cedar-lined, no electrical light, no decoration, no ghost, just extraordinary craftsmanship. Alden shone his flashlight ahead. The passage extended roughly 15 feet. That explained the missing volume. Almost. Kepler stepped to the threshold, sniffed. Alden waited. The dog moved forward willingly. Alden followed. The roar of the waterfall softened immediately, not vanished, softened. The walls insulated the sound. At the end stood another door. This one was beautifully made. Dark-aged wood, hand-fitted joints, no lock. Across the center, words had been carved into the surface. Alden brushed dust from them. Not every treasure needs to shine. He exhaled. Silas had a flair for drama. Kepler's nose touched the lower corner. Alden opened the door. His flashlight entered first, then stopped moving. The room beyond was larger than he expected. A workshop, not a storage closet, not a panic room. A real working studio hidden behind the watermill wall. A heavy drafting table occupied the center beneath a rectangular skylight clouded by 30 years of dust. Shelves lined both sides of the room. Dozens of rolled blueprints rested inside wooden tubes. Hand tools hung in careful rows. Squares, compasses, planes, chisels, measuring rods. Architectural models sat beneath cloth covers. Maps covered one wall. A faded brown canvas work jacket still hung from a wooden peg. A carpenter pencil remained tucked into its chest pocket. The room felt interrupted rather than abandoned. Alden took 2 steps inside. Dust moved beneath his boots. On one shelf sat a framed photograph of an older man. Alden knew immediately who it had to be. Silas Everett North appeared to be in his late 60s when the photograph was taken. Tall but lean, perhaps around 5'11", with the strong hands and shoulders of a man who had spent as much time building as drawing. His face was long and slightly square, the jaw still defined beneath light silver stubble. Pale gray-blue eyes looked directly at the camera beneath deeply lined lids. His skin had the sun-worn tone of someone who worked outdoors, and his hair was a mixture of gray and brown, fuller at the sides and thinning slightly on top. He wore the same faded brown canvas work jacket now hanging only a few feet away, a light gray chambray work shirt visible beneath it. No suit, no architect's tie. Silas looked more like a carpenter who happened to understand buildings than a man who expected buildings to make him famous. Alden moved deeper into the room. The opposite wall stopped him. Photographs. Dozens of them, small houses, different locations, different families. No mansions, no lake estates, no luxury lodges, simple homes, one-story cottages, small cabins, modest houses with porches. Under each photograph was a family name and a date. Miller 1989, Corbett 1991, Alvarez 1993, Reed 1994. Some photographs showed couples, some showed single adults, some showed people standing beside moving boxes. The common feature was not architecture, it was expression. People looked relieved. Alden stepped closer to the largest photograph. Silas stood beside the watermill when the structure was much newer. The roof was clean, the porch straight, the wheel freshly built. Beside Silas stood a younger man. He appeared around 40, perhaps 6 feet tall, lean but strong, with fairly broad shoulders beneath a faded charcoal gray work shirt whose sleeves had been rolled to the elbows. His face was long and visibly tired, the cheekbones slightly hollow, jaw defined beneath uneven brown stubble. Short, medium brown hair had been cut practically but not with military precision. His skin was tanned. What caught Alden were the eyes, blue-gray, remarkably similar to Silas's. But where Silas's expression looked steady, the younger man seemed as though sleep had become something difficult to trust. Faint darkness lay beneath his eyes. A brown canvas tool belt hung around his waist. One hand rested against a newly repaired spoke of the water wheel. Kepler walked to the photograph, sat. Alden read the small handwritten caption beneath it. Jonah, first night, 6 hours. 6 hours of what? Work? Sleep? Silence. Alden did not know. On the drafting table rested a leather-bound journal. He lifted it carefully. The cover had softened from years of handling. No decoration. No title. Alden opened the first page. 2 words had been written at the top. Jonah North. Alden looked back toward the photograph, then toward Silas's abandoned jacket. He had assumed the watermill existed because an architect had wanted to build something clever. 5 missing feet, a concealed passage, a workshop inside the wall, a wheel that controlled a hidden mechanical latch. But the photograph suggested something else. Silas had not begun with architecture. He had begun with a person, and whatever happened here had started with a man named Jonah, whom Silas apparently had not known how to save. Jonah North was Silas Everett North's younger brother. Alden learned that before sunrise. He had remained in the hidden workshop long after the fire in the main cabin had burned low, sitting at the old drafting table with the leather journal open beneath the weak beam of a portable lamp. Kepler slept near the workshop door. The German shepherd had chosen a place where he could see both the narrow passage and Alden, though even here his posture remained looser than it would have been in almost any unfamiliar room. His black and tan coat absorbed the shadows except where the light caught the warm fur along his chest and forelegs. Every now and then, the torn edge of his right ear twitched at some distant change in the water outside. Alden turned another page. Silas had not begun Jonah's story with the war. He had begun with laughter. Before leaving home, Jonah had apparently been the North family's most exhausting source of noise. He talked to strangers. He talked while repairing things. He talked when nobody was listening. He could walk into a bar where he knew no one and leave an hour later knowing which bartender had an unreliable truck, which farmer's daughter had just been accepted to college, and which old man in the corner had once played minor league baseball. Jonah loved clocks, not collecting them, repairing them. Silas wrote that Jonah could sit at a kitchen table for hours with springs, gears, tiny screws, and magnifying lenses spread around him, restoring watches that sensible people would have thrown away. He also played the harmonica badly. Silas had underlined badly twice. Alden almost smiled. It was the first time the dead architect had sounded like a brother rather than an engineer. Then the handwriting changed. Not the shape of the letters, the space between them. The entries after Jonah returned from war were shorter. He no longer played music. He stopped repairing watches. He did not go into bars. He avoided family gatherings because too many voices at once exhausted him. He sat near doors. He flinched when kitchen cabinets slammed. He hated long hallways because he could not see what waited around the end. He preferred chairs placed against walls. Most nights, he did not sleep for more than an hour or 2. When he did sleep, he woke violently. Silas wrote that their mother once found Jonah sleeping in his pickup behind the family home even though an empty bedroom waited 15 yards away. When she asked why, Jonah answered only, "I can leave faster from here." Alden stopped reading. The sentence stayed in the room. He looked toward the narrow hidden passage. For several seconds, the workshop felt smaller, not because of the walls, because he understood the logic. He had never slept in his truck behind a family home. But he knew the impulse, control the exit, stay ready, never let comfort become dependence. Alden leaned back in the chair. Kepler opened his eyes. "I'm reading," Alden said quietly. The dog watched him. "That means no commentary." Kepler lowered his head again. Alden continued. Silas had tried to help Jonah in every way a successful older brother with money and influence might try. Doctors, family, a quieter apartment, a house outside town, a cottage near a lake. Nothing lasted. Jonah could function. That was what everyone kept misunderstanding. He could work, drive, shop, fix machinery, speak when necessary. He was not helpless. But he had become a man who spent nearly all his strength managing ordinary places. The world demanded more energy from him than it seemed to demand from everyone else. Silas wrote that this was what frightened him most. Jonah appeared capable enough that people stopped asking what things cost him. At the time, Silas's own career had never been stronger. He designed luxury lodges and private retreats throughout northern Minnesota and Wisconsin. He won awards. Magazines photographed his buildings. Wealthy clients praised his understanding of human comfort. Silas hated that phrase. One journal entry read, "I was being congratulated for understanding comfort while my own brother could not sit through dinner in any house I had designed." That failure changed the direction of his work. Silas began studying Jonah not as a patient, as an occupant. What made one room easier than another? Why did Jonah stay longer in some places? Why did he choose certain chairs? Why did he sleep better near moving water? Why did a small room sometimes feel safer than a large one? Silas stopped asking, "What should a beautiful house contain?" He started asking, "What does this particular human being need the house not to demand from him?" The question eventually brought him to the abandoned watermill. At that time, the building had been little more than a deteriorating shell beside the waterfall. The roof leaked. The original mill machinery had failed. The wheel was damaged. The floor had rotted along one side. Silas bought it cheaply. Everyone assumed he intended to turn it into one of his high-end retreats. Instead, he stripped the interior almost to the frame. Alden rose from the drafting table and walked into the passage, then out into the main cabin. The journal remained open in his hand. Now that he knew what Silas had been trying to do, details Alden had already noticed began arranging themselves into a pattern. The main room was small enough to understand at a glance. No long corridor divided the living area from the exit. The front door could be seen from nearly every major position in the cabin. The windows were deep but broad enough to provide a clear view of the forest. Natural light entered from more than one direction. The ceiling was not low enough to feel oppressive, but it was not so high that the room lost scale. The stove sat where a person could warm himself, without having his back fully exposed to the entrance. Silas had softened corners where possible, built storage into walls, reduced clutter, avoided unnecessary doors. The water itself had been part of the design, not merely scenery. Alden returned to the workshop. Silas had experimented with the flume until the wheel produced a slow, regular mechanical rhythm beneath the continuous sound of the falls. Not loud, not silent, predictable. Jonah agreed to stay one night. Silas expected him to leave before midnight. He did not. The next morning, Silas found his brother still asleep. 6 hours. That explained the photograph. Jonah, first night, 6 hours. Silas had recorded the event with the precision of an experiment. But beneath the measurements and observations, his next sentence had been written in darker ink. Alden read it once, then again. "I heard my brother snoring. I went outside to the porch and cried." Alden lowered the journal. That was all. No speech, no revelation, no miracle. A brother sleeping. A brother listening. A brother crying quietly so the sleeping man would not hear. Alden rested his forearms on the drafting table. He had slept through artillery before, through engines, through storms, through hours when exhaustion simply overpowered vigilance. Yet that line reached somewhere those memories did not. Maybe because Silas had not celebrated a cure. He had celebrated 6 ordinary hours. 6 hours that most people would have forgotten by breakfast. For Jonah, they had been evidence that his body still remembered how to rest. Alden looked toward Kepler. The dog had become still, his breathing slow. The old working harness lay on a hook near the main room, leaving his body unburdened while he rested. "You picked a strange place," Alden murmured. Kepler did not move. Alden wondered if that was the wrong way to think about it. Maybe Kepler had simply picked the first place that asked less of both of them. One page in Silas's journal had been written nearly a year after Jonah's first night at the mill. Alden almost passed over it. Only one paragraph occupied the page. Silas had written, "Today Jonah repaired a single wooden peg in the wheel. Nothing else. He worked 14 minutes. Then he sat on the porch for an hour. Yesterday he would not touch the tools. Tomorrow he may refuse again. But today the wheel carries one piece he chose to save." At the bottom, in a different hand, someone had added 4 words. It held, "So did I." Alden stared at the sentence. The handwriting was rougher than Silas's, Jonah's. He looked through the workshop doorway toward the old wheel outside. For the first time, the machine no longer seemed like part of the house. It seemed like a record, not of recovery in some clean upward line, of tiny acts of choosing not to abandon what was still capable of carrying weight. And Alden suddenly understood why the wheel had survived even when replacing it would have been easier. Jonah's progress remained uneven. Silas never pretended otherwise. Some weeks were better, some were worse. There were stretches when Jonah left the mill and disappeared back into his old routines. Then he returned. He started with the wheel, one wooden peg, then a damaged spoke. He sanded the edges until his hands cramped. Weeks later, he repaired part of the flume. He began maintaining the iron axle. He sharpened tools. Eventually, the small repairs became a routine. Silas noticed that Jonah spoke more while his hands were occupied. At first, only practical words. Hold that. Wrong size. Water's too high. Then complaints. Then jokes. One journal entry recorded Jonah saying the wheel had the personality of a mule with arthritis. Alden smiled at that. Dry humor apparently ran in families. Jonah began repairing watches again. Not professionally, just one at a time. Silas placed a small bench near the east window where morning light was strongest. Jonah kept screws in shallow wooden trays and worked while the falls rolled behind him. He played the harmonica again too, still badly. Silas noted this with relief disguised as irritation. The watermill did not return Jonah to the person he had been. That was not how life worked. There was no reset, no clean restoration to factory condition. Jonah remained quieter, still disliked crowds, still slept poorly sometimes, still needed more control over his surroundings than other people seemed to need. But he also laughed, worked, built, rested, invited Silas to sit with him without finding an excuse to leave. That was enough to change Silas's career. He began turning down luxury commissions. At first, clients thought he was taking a sabbatical. Then he sold his city office. He moved his work north. Using savings, private donations, and a small network of builders, Silas began designing modest homes, based on a principle that sounded embarrassingly simple. The person should matter more than the building. Stillwater Homes grew from that idea. Alden spent the next several hours studying folders from the workshop shelves. The people Stillwater served were not all veterans. That surprised him. There were widows who had lost homes after a spouse died and debt swallowed everything. Families displaced by wildfire. A firefighter who could no longer tolerate apartment living after a building collapse. A mother working 2 jobs who had never accumulated enough money for a down payment. An older factory worker whose plant had closed after 32 years. A man recovering from a disabling accident. Single parents, first responders. People who had experienced enough instability that a permanent address became more than paperwork. Silas did not describe them as damaged. He rarely even described them as vulnerable. He preferred the phrase, people in transition. Alden liked that. Transition implied movement, not failure. Stillwater houses were small, usually 1 or 2 bedrooms, simple materials, easy maintenance, natural light, no unnecessary grandeur. Each design changed depending on the future occupant. For someone sensitive to noise, Silas changed orientation and insulation. For a person with limited mobility, thresholds disappeared and storage lowered. For families, he placed shared rooms where people could see one another without being forced together. For residents who disliked feeling trapped, he created visible exits and multiple exterior views. He did not claim architecture could heal grief or trauma. One note said, walls cannot do the work a human life must do, but walls can stop making the work harder. Alden copied that sentence onto a scrap of paper. He did not know why. Stillwater had another unusual rule. Nobody received a house entirely free. Not because Silas believed poor people needed to prove gratitude. The opposite. He wanted ownership to begin with choice. Residents paid what the program called a symbolic purchase amount. Sometimes $100, sometimes $50, sometimes $10. For people at the very edge, $1. Alden stopped turning pages. He sat very still. The bill he had handed Maggie came back to him, $1. He had assumed it was a legal technicality, a strange old trust requirement, maybe even Silas's sense of humor. Now he understood. The dollar had never been the price of lumber. It was participation. A person did not receive the house. They chose it. They accepted responsibility for what came next. Alden whispered the idea without meaning to. I'm staying because I chose to. Kepler raised his head. Alden glanced at him. Apparently we've signed up for philosophy. Kepler yawned. Exactly. The records became larger in scope during Silas's final years. He had purchased roughly 140 acres surrounding the waterfall. Alden found the original parcel map. Calvin's number had been correct. That irritated him. Silas intended the land to support a dispersed network of small cabins, not a settlement, not an institution, no rows of identical buildings. He wanted each house separated enough to preserve privacy, while still close enough that residents could choose community when ready. 6-month stays, a year, sometimes longer. Stillwater was meant to be a bridge rather than a destination. Alden could imagine it. Small cabins hidden among birch and spruce, paths instead of wide roads, a workshop, maybe shared storage, a place where a person could disappear just enough to stop feeling watched without disappearing so completely that nobody could find them. But the plan stopped, abruptly. Funding correspondence grew tense, several donors withdrew. A proposed expansion grant failed. Then came letters involving land development rights. Silas had rejected offers from an investment group interested in the waterfall corridor. He believed the commercial project would make Stillwater impossible. Legal language followed. Parcel restrictions, access rights, a conservation agreement. Then Silas's notes became sparse. He was older, his handwriting less steady. One entry mentioned health problems without detail. Another said Jonah had moved away but continued visiting. Then the record nearly ended. Alden moved to a long cabinet beneath the map wall. Inside he found trust documents. Most were copies, some were incomplete. Together, they explained why the watermill mattered. The cabin was not just a building inside the Stillwater property. It was the anchor parcel. Certain restrictions across the surrounding land remained tied to its legal status. If the mill remained protected under the trust, reorganizing the entire 140 acres for major commercial development would be difficult. If that status failed, the situation changed. Calvin's interest made more sense now. Alden felt no triumph in discovering it, just weight. $40,000 no longer represented someone wanting an old cabin. It represented the first move in something much larger, and Alden still did not know whether preserving Silas's unfinished dream was automatically the right choice. The town needed work. Calvin had not invented that. A dead man's intentions mattered. Living people did too. Alden returned to the drafting table. Near the wheel design, Silas had written a sentence in dark pencil. Never replace what can still be repaired. Beneath it, added later, a scarred beam that still carries weight has earned the right to remain. Alden read the line slowly, then looked at his own hands. Small scars crossed the knuckles. One finger no longer fully straightened. His left shoulder still hurt from the fall. His old military watch showed scratches deep enough to catch a thumbnail. He thought of Jonah sanding one spoke at a time. He thought of Kepler rising stiffly on cold mornings, then walking until his joints loosened. He thought of the watermill itself, crooked, patched, still standing. Alden disliked metaphors when they became too obvious. This one did not ask permission. Silas had not been writing only about wood. Across from the drafting table stood a plain wooden chair. Alden had noticed it before but assumed it belonged to the workshop. Now he found a design note explaining otherwise. Every Stillwater house was supposed to include a second chair, not necessarily the same design, not necessarily in the same room, but there should always be one intentional place for another person to sit. Silas wrote, not for the therapist, not for the inspector, not for whoever arrives with forms, for the person who eventually comes when the resident is ready not to be alone. Alden lowered the paper. Evelyn came to mind immediately. The apple bread, the ride to the clinic, her refusal to turn his injury into a lecture, the simple way she had answered when he said he needed help. No celebration, no pity, just, tell me where you are. Alden had spent years believing independence meant minimizing every need. Maybe that was not independence. Maybe sometimes it was simply fear with better posture. Kepler rose and walked over. The dog rested his muzzle briefly against Alden's forearm. Alden looked at the empty chair. Don't get ambitious, he told him. We're not starting a book club. Kepler leaned harder. Alden gave in and scratched beneath his jaw. The afternoon faded while Alden continued sorting files. One folder described early trust formation. Another contained land surveys. Then, behind a stack of architectural specifications, he found a thin legal file marked with a red strip. He opened it. The first page contained formal language. The second summarized several conditions. Alden read faster. The watermill had been designated as Stillwater's anchor property. Silas had prepared a final legal activation tying the original program, conservation restrictions, and several surrounding parcels together. But the process had not been completed in the surviving public copies. A handwritten note appeared across the bottom. Watermill Trust. Final activation pending beneath it. Original certification required. Alden checked the next page, then the next. No certification. He searched the folder again. Empty. He moved through the cabinet. Nothing. Blueprint tubes. Nothing. Desk drawers. Nothing. He checked beneath the drafting surface. Inside Silas's old satchel. Behind the map frames. Nothing. Alden stood in the middle of the workshop, the legal file in his hands. The most important document in the entire Stillwater archive, the one capable of determining whether Silas's unfinished project still had legal weight, was missing. Kepler sat beside the drafting table, watching him. Alden looked at the old room around them. Silas had hidden an entire workshop behind a wall. He had preserved years of designs, letters, photographs, trust papers, but not the one document that mattered most. Alden slowly closed the folder. On the cover, the words remained visible, original certification required. And somewhere between Silas North's unfinished dream and the present, the certification had disappeared. By the end of the week, the hidden workshop was no longer Alden's secret. He had not announced it. He had not called reporters. He had told Maggie because the archive belonged to a history she understood better than he did, and Maggie had quietly contacted someone she trusted to determine whether the papers were genuine. That someone was Dr. Naomi Bell. Naomi arrived at the watermill on a cold morning beneath a sky the pale blue of early winter. She was 48, about 5'7", slim but strong in the practical way of someone accustomed to carrying document cases through old buildings and climbing ladders in abandoned structures. Her face was slightly long, with defined cheekbones, dark brown eyes that seemed to inspect details before deciding what they meant, and light olive skin touched by the dry northern cold. Dark brown hair, threaded with a few early silver strands, fell to her shoulders but was tied low at the back of her neck. Thin black-framed glasses rested on a narrow nose. She wore a rust-brown corduroy field jacket over a forest-green crew-neck sweater, dark straight-leg jeans, brown lace-up field boots, and carried a weathered leather document satchel. Nothing about her suggested the romantic idea of a historian discovering lost treasure. Naomi looked like a woman who expected treasure to be mislabeled, water-damaged, and buried beneath tax records. That suited Alden. Kepler inspected her at the porch. The German shepherd stood calmly, his lean black and tan frame balanced over all 4 feet, amber-brown eyes fixed on the newcomer. Naomi stopped rather than reaching toward him. Working dog? Retired. Does he like strangers? He likes people who don't immediately put their hands on his head. Naomi nodded. Reasonable policy. Kepler sniffed the air once and moved aside. Alden decided that counted as approval. Inside the hidden workshop, Naomi became almost completely silent. She put on thin archival gloves, examined Silas's handwriting, checked paper stock, studied the blueprint stamps, compared dates, opened drawers slowly. At one point she stood beneath the dusty skylight staring at Silas's old drafting table for nearly a full minute. Alden finally asked, "Bad?" Naomi looked at him. The opposite. She removed her glasses, cleaned them with the edge of her sweater, then put them back on. Silas Everett North was real. Very real. You sound surprised. I'm surprised this survived. She explained that Silas had once been a respected architect across the upper Midwest. His name appeared in professional journals from the 1970s through the early 1990s. He had designed lodges, wilderness retreats, municipal buildings, and several houses considered unusually thoughtful for their time. Then his career had changed direction. Commissions became smaller. Publications became rarer. Eventually his name almost disappeared. There were rumors he retired, Naomi said. Some people assumed health problems. Some thought he'd simply become difficult. He became interested in houses nobody could brag about. Naomi glanced at Alden. That will do it. She spent 2 days cataloging the workshop. The Stillwater drawings fascinated her more than the luxury designs Silas had once been known for. They aren't just architectural plans, she said. What are they? Case studies. Alden disliked the phrase immediately. Naomi saw it. Not medical case studies. Human ones. She showed him one sheet. A small house, 2 bedrooms, a porch. Nothing dramatic. But along the margins, Silas had recorded notes from the future occupant. Morning light too strong. Kitchen needs sightline to back door. No overhead cabinets above stove. Bedroom window must open without standing. He was designing around people, Naomi said, not around what would photograph well. Exactly. She moved to another blueprint. He was decades ahead of what some architects now call trauma-informed design, though I doubt he'd have used that phrase. Alden folded his arms. Would he have claimed it fixed people? Naomi looked sharply at him. No. That answer came quickly enough to satisfy him. A building can't do that, she continued. But a badly designed environment can certainly make a difficult life harder. Silas seems to have understood the difference. By the 3rd day, Naomi had confirmed enough to contact several archival organizations. That was when money entered the story. An attorney representing a private architectural collector called. The collector wanted the Stillwater archive, original blueprints, correspondence, design notebooks, selected photographs. The offer was $300,000. Alden sat at the kitchen table with the phone against his ear. Outside, Kepler moved through fallen birch leaves near the stream. 300,000, Alden repeated. The attorney confirmed it. Alden looked through the doorway toward the workshop. Silas's faded brown canvas jacket still hung where he had left it decades earlier. The second wooden chair remained near the drafting table. $300,000 could erase most of Alden's immediate problems. He could pay creditors, repair the truck, finish the watermill properly, put money aside for Kepler's veterinary care as the dog grew older, maybe even stop calculating whether he could afford meat twice in the same week. The attorney kept speaking. Alden waited until he finished. No, a pause. Mr. Whitaker, perhaps you should take some time. I did. You've had the offer less than 2 minutes. It wasn't complicated. The man tried again. Alden ended politely. When he told Naomi, she studied him over the top of her glasses. You know $300,000 is a lot of money. I've heard. You don't want to know whether they'll increase it? No. Naomi looked toward the archive. Why? Alden thought about it. Because I don't think Silas hid all this so somebody could put it in a private room. Naomi's expression softened almost imperceptibly. That, she said, is probably the correct historical answer. Alden shrugged. I was aiming for the cheap answer. The larger offer arrived 4 days later. Calvin Russ came in person. No jokes this time. No smile aimed at the collapsing porch. He parked his dark pickup beside the clearing and walked toward the watermill carrying only a folder. Kepler remained on the porch, watching him. Calvin stopped below the steps. $750,000. Alden was holding a cedar board. He set it down. For what? All of it. Define all, the mill, the archive, your interest in the surrounding property, any assignable rights connected to Stillwater. Alden stared at him. Calvin continued. You keep whatever personal property you've brought here. How generous. I'm trying to make this simple. It was simpler at $25,000. Calvin's jaw tightened. $750 is serious money. So was $25 when I had $12 in checking. Calvin exhaled. $900,000. Alden looked at him. Calvin opened the folder. A contract summary. Investor names. Timelines. A deposit structure. This was no improvised negotiation. Calvin had come prepared. $1 million, he said. The waterfall filled the silence between them. Even Alden felt the number. $1 million. Not theoretical value. Not development projections. Money. Enough to close debts that had been following him for years. Enough to buy another house outright. Enough to stop taking roofing jobs in freezing wind. Enough to replace the pickup that made new noises every week. Enough to create a fund for Kepler's care. Enough to wake up without doing arithmetic before coffee. Alden looked toward the dog. Kepler had lowered himself onto the porch but remained alert. 7 years old, still strong, but not forever. For one uncomfortable second, Alden imagined an easier future. A small piece of land somewhere else. A warm shop. A veterinarian without worrying about the bill. No legal fight, no collapsing flume. No responsibility for a dead architect's unfinished dream. Calvin saw hesitation. There's no shame in taking the to him. I didn't say there was. Then be practical. I am. Whitaker, you bought this place for $1, I remember, and now somebody is offering you $1 million. I heard that part too. Calvin stepped closer. His voice stayed controlled. This isn't just about profit. Alden said nothing. The resort means jobs, real ones. Construction first. Then hospitality, maintenance, food service, trail crews. 80 seasonal positions, maybe 30 year-round. The road gets rebuilt. Emergency vehicles get better access. Tax revenue goes up. Alden looked toward the trees. Calvin continued. You can keep Silas's memory. Put up a plaque. Name a building after him if that's what matters. Then came the sentence Alden could not dismiss. But memory doesn't pay 80 families. Alden did not answer. Calvin waited. He had expected resistance. He had not expected silence. That silence mattered because Calvin was not entirely wrong. North Haven did need work. Alden had seen the empty storefront near the diner. The hardware clerk whose son had moved to Fargo because there was no decent job nearby. The roofing contractor who drove 40 miles for larger projects. Preserving one man's dream while living people struggled could become its own kind of selfishness. Alden hated choices where both sides carried something true. Those were the choices that stayed with a man. Calvin closed the folder. $1 million. Think about it overnight. This time Alden let him leave without saying no. That evening Naomi had gone back to town, and the watermill became quiet except for the waterfall and the stove. The unsigned $1 million offer lay on Silas's drafting table. Alden sat in the first chair. The second chair stood empty across from him. Kepler entered the workshop without being called. The German shepherd passed the contract, past Alden, then did something he had never done before. He walked directly to the empty second chair. He sniffed its seat once. Instead of returning to Alden, Kepler lowered himself beside it and rested his shoulder against one wooden leg. Alden stared. The gesture meant nothing supernatural. Perhaps Evelyn's scent still clung faintly to the jacket she had worn when she had briefly visited the workshop days earlier. Perhaps the wood held some other familiar smell. Perhaps Kepler simply preferred that corner. But Alden remembered Silas's purpose for the second chair. A place for another person when the resident was finally ready not to be alone. And suddenly Alden understood what the $1 million was really offering. Not just freedom from debt, permission to disappear again. He could take the money, leave North Haven, and turn every new relationship back into another temporary address. For years that would have sounded like freedom. Now, for the first time, it sounded lonely. Kepler closed his eyes beside the empty chair. Alden did not touch the contract again that night. He opened one of Silas's final journals instead. The entries were harder to read. Silas's handwriting had become less steady. His thoughts had not. Years earlier, another development company had approached him about the waterfall property. They had offered enough money to secure Silas's retirement. Their arguments sounded painfully familiar. Jobs, tax base, improved access, tourism. Silas had not dismissed those things. One entry surprised Alden. The developer is not evil for wanting to build. The town is not foolish for wanting employment. I would distrust myself if preserving Stillwater required pretending those needs were imaginary. Alden kept reading. Then came the line that stopped him. But if every beautiful place is ultimately reserved for whoever can pay the most to reach it, then the people who most need peace will always arrive last. Alden leaned back. That was the distinction. Silas had not believed land should never create money. He believed this particular land had already been assigned another purpose. Alden looked through the workshop doorway toward the wheel. The old mechanism had been misbehaving all afternoon. One spoke had warped enough to catch slightly near the lower housing. He set down the journal. Work was easier than philosophy. Outside, cold mist settled on his olive-green field jacket. Kepler followed him. Alden shut part of the flume gate to slow the wheel, locked the mechanism, then examined the damaged spoke. It would have been easier to replace it. The wood was old, scarred, dark from decades of water. But most of the spoke remained sound. Alden removed the damaged brace, sanded the warped edge, added a carefully cut reinforcement, drilled, bolted, tightened. Kepler sat on the dry stones nearby, dark olive harness catching droplets of mist. Alden worked until his fingers stiffened in the cold. Then he released the wheel. Water entered the paddles, the repaired spoke descended, past the housing. No catch. The wheel continued. 1 rotation, 2, 3, still imperfect, still creaking, still carrying weight. Alden rested one hand against the damp rail. Silas's words returned, not as a slogan, as an instruction. Repair what could still carry weight. He thought about the watermill, Jonah, Kepler, his own life. Then, unexpectedly, North Haven. A town could be old without being finished. It could need repair without being replaced by something designed entirely for strangers. Maybe Calvin was right that Stillwater alone could not sustain the town, but perhaps Alden's choice did not have to be between preserving a dead man's shrine and building a luxury resort. There might be a third answer. The thought was new. More importantly, it was the first time Alden had imagined himself still being here long enough to help build it. The next morning, Calvin returned. Alden was waiting outside. The contract folder sat on the porch railing. Calvin looked at it, then at him. 1 million. Alden nodded. Still no. Calvin's expression hardened. You're turning down $1 million for this, he gestured toward the roof. The patched wall, the wheel, looks that way. Why? Alden glanced at the waterfall. Because I don't think the choice is your resort or nothing. Calvin laughed once without humor. What exactly is your alternative? I don't know yet. That isn't an alternative. No, it's a beginning. Calvin folded his arms. So you're going to preserve 140 acres because a dead architect wrote nice sentences? No. Alden met his eyes. I'm going to find out whether Stillwater can do what Silas intended and still bring work into town. Calvin looked genuinely surprised. Alden continued. Construction, maintenance, forestry, training, maybe partnerships with local trades. If it lives again, it can't just consume donations and call itself noble. You've been here a few weeks. I know. You're not from North Haven. I know that too. You don't know how many development plans this town has watched die. Probably more than I do. Calvin studied him. Alden added, That's why I'm not asking you to believe me. What are you asking? Nothing. He picked up the contract and handed it back. I'll take it to the county board when I have something worth presenting. Calvin did not take the folder immediately. When he finally did, his expression had changed. Not respect, not yet, something closer to recalculation. You think the trust gives you that much time? Alden's eyes narrowed. Calvin saw it. There was the real reason for the visit. The trust isn't fully activated, Calvin said. I know. Do you? I know the original certification is missing. Calvin gave a small nod. Then you know more than I expected. How much do you know? Enough. Alden waited. Calvin looked toward the old watermill. The county review is scheduled for winter. Existing restrictions remain in place for now. But if nobody proves the final Stillwater activation was completed, some of those restrictions can be challenged. By you. By anyone with standing. You. Calvin did not deny it. Alden felt anger rise but kept his voice level. You knew that when you offered 25,000, yes. 40, yes. The million. Calvin looked directly at him, yes. Alden almost admired the honesty. Almost. Calvin tucked the folder beneath his arm. You're gambling 140 acres on a document that may have never been executed. The file says it existed. The file says it was required. Silas wasn't careless. Even careful men die before finishing things. That landed closer than Calvin intended. Alden looked toward the watermill, a half-repaired house, an unfinished program, a missing certification, a life interrupted before the final paperwork reached the county. Maybe Calvin was right. Maybe there was nothing left to find. Calvin stepped toward his truck. You have until the review to prove it. Alden called after him. You sound pretty confident. Calvin turned. I've spent years working with county property records. So did Maggie. For the first time, Calvin's expression shifted, barely, enough. Then he recovered. Good luck, Whitaker. The truck disappeared into the forest. Alden stood beside the porch. Kepler came to his side. The old German shepherd's shoulder pressed lightly against Alden's leg. 140 acres, Alden murmured. $1 million. A missing piece of paper. Kepler stared toward the stream. Alden looked down at him. I miss the days when you just wanted tennis balls. Kepler's tail moved once. That afternoon, Alden returned to the hidden workshop. Naomi had organized the documents into temporary archival boxes. The legal file remained open on one table. Alden searched again, not because he expected different results, but because doing nothing felt worse. Desk drawers, map cases, shelving, blueprint tubes, tool cabinets, nothing. Kepler wandered slowly through the room. Alden barely noticed at first. The dog stopped near Silas's old faded brown canvas work jacket. It still hung from its peg, untouched except when Naomi had inspected its pockets. Kepler raised his nose, sniffed the lower hem, then the sleeve. Alden looked over. Nothing in there. We checked. Kepler ignored him. The dog stepped sideways, sniffed again. Not the jacket this time. The cedar wall behind it. His ears shifted forward. Alden became still. Kepler moved his nose along the boards, stopped directly behind the hanging coat, then looked back at Alden. The jacket had been checked. The wall had not. And in a house built by Silas Everett North, Alden had learned one thing very clearly. A wall was never just a wall. The cedar boards behind Silas North's old work jacket were different. Not visibly, not at first. But Alden had learned that the watermill rewarded patience more often than force. He removed the faded brown canvas jacket from its wooden peg and laid it carefully across the drafting table. The garment still held its old shape in the shoulders, as though Silas might return at any moment, slide his arms into it, and complain about strangers rearranging his workshop. Kepler stood beside the exposed wall. The 7-year-old German shepherd lowered his black muzzle toward one narrow vertical joint, inhaled, then moved his nose upward. Alden pressed the board. Nothing. He examined the grain. One section had been cut separately and fitted so precisely into the surrounding cedar that age had hidden the boundary rather than revealing it. Alden slid the tip of a thin putty knife into the seam. The panel released. Behind it was a shallow cavity, no deed, no certification, no brass seal. Just a flat metal canister wrapped in deteriorated cloth. Alden lifted it out. Inside rested a reel of old film. A handwritten label was attached to the can. If the watermill survives, show them why. Alden stared at the sentence. Kepler sat beside him. You know, Alden murmured, most people leave normal instructions. Kepler blinked. That's what I thought. Dr. Naomi Bell arrived that afternoon. She handled the reel more cautiously than Alden had handled unexploded ordnance. 16 millimeter, she said after examining the film leader beneath a portable light. Old acetate stock, probably. Maybe late 80s or early 90s. Can we play it? Not on anything in this building unless you want to turn history into confetti. Naomi adjusted her thin black-framed glasses. The 48-year-old historian looked almost offended by the idea of improvisation. Her rust-brown corduroy field jacket was buttoned against the cold. and several strands of dark hair streaked with silver had escaped the low tie at her neck. She was not dramatic by nature. That made her next words carry more weight. "If this is what I think it is, we don't touch it again until it's properly transferred." Naomi contacted a regional preservation lab she had worked with before. The reel was stabilized, scanned, and digitally transferred over the following days. Alden hated waiting. Waiting gave a man too much time to imagine outcomes. He repaired a roof seam, split firewood, rebuilt part of the flume gate, checked county parcel maps until the numbers blurred. The original certification remained missing. The winter review date remained fixed, and Calvin Rusk remained quiet. That worried Alden more than another offer would have. 4 days later, Naomi called. They recovered almost all of it. Alden sat straighter. Almost. Some edge damage. A few missing frames. Nothing important enough to lose the narrative. What narrative? You should see it with everyone else. Alden frowned. Everyone? Naomi had already spoken with Maggie and the North Haven Historical Committee. If the film documented Stillwater's original public purpose, she argued, hiding it would accomplish nothing. Silas had written show them why, not show Alden why. That Saturday evening, North Haven's community hall filled beyond what Alden expected. The building was an old brick structure near the library, with polished maple floors, folding chairs, fluorescent lights, and framed photographs of local high school teams dating back decades. Alden chose a seat near the side. Naturally, Kepler lay beside his boots in the dark olive working harness, calm but alert, his amber-brown eyes tracking movement without anxiety. Maggie Bellwether sat in the front row, small and straight-backed in her weathered sage-green barn jacket. At 78, she seemed almost swallowed by the folding chair, but her pale blue eyes remained sharper than most of the people around her. Evelyn Mercer sat 2 seats away. Her deep burgundy quilted vest stood out against the gray room, and her warm hazel eyes found Alden briefly. She lifted one hand. Not a wave exactly, acknowledgement. Alden nodded. Calvin came too. He stood at the back for several minutes before taking a chair near the aisle. His square face was unreadable. The dark navy waxed coat remained on his shoulders, and the neatly combed brown and gray hair made him look more prepared for a land meeting than a historical screening. Naomi stood beside the projector screen. This film was discovered in Silas Everett North's private workshop, she told the room. It appears to have been recorded shortly before his final attempt to formalize Stillwater. The lights dimmed, static, white flicker. Then an image stabilized, the watermill, but not the watermill Alden knew. The roof was new, the porch straight, the cedar siding still golden. The wheel turned smoothly beneath clean water. A younger Silas stepped into frame. He was thinner than in the later photograph, but unmistakable. Long, slightly square face, pale gray-blue eyes, suntanned skin, brown hair already graying, and the same faded work jacket before age had softened the fabric. His recorded voice was quieter than Alden expected. "This is not a hospital," a pause in the damaged film. Then, "It is not treatment." Silas stood on the porch while water moved behind him. "It is not charity housing." The image shifted. Jonah appeared. Around 40 then, lean but strong, faded charcoal worker shirt rolled to the elbows, dark olive work pants, tool belt low around his waist. He was repairing the wheel. Not posing. Working, Silas continued. Stillwater exists for people who have spent too much of life surviving ordinary days. Alden felt something change in the room. People stopped shifting in their chairs. Silas explained the idea simply. A person might need 6 months, a year, maybe longer, not to disappear permanently, not to avoid life, but to have a place quiet enough to remember what ordinary life felt like. Cook breakfast, repair something, sleep, walk outside, invite someone over, leave and come back by choice. The film showed modest cabins, men and women planting small gardens, a woman painting a window frame, a firefighter splitting wood, a mother sitting on a porch reading while laundry moved in the wind. Nothing looked dramatic. That was the point. Silas's voice returned. "If a house becomes the most interesting thing in the photograph, I have probably designed the wrong house." A small laugh moved through the hall. Even Alden smiled. Then the film cut to Jonah again. He sat near the wheel with a pocket watch open in his hand. Silas, somewhere behind the camera, asked him a question Alden could not hear. Jonah glanced up. His expression was tired but amused. He answered, "Still here." 2 words. The screen flickered. The room became utterly quiet. Then Silas appeared closer to the camera, older now. The change suggested the film had been assembled over several years. He looked directly into the lens, not at an architect, not at a county board, at whoever might someday be watching. "One day," he said, "someone will argue this land is too valuable for what we are doing here." Several heads in the hall turned slightly. Calvin did not move. Silas continued. They may be correct about the value. Alden leaned forward. The mistake will be believing money is the only way land proves what it is worth. Then Silas reached below the frame and lifted a narrow brass cylinder. Alden stopped breathing. Silas held it up. If Stillwater ever needs to prove what it was meant to be, the certification belongs where Jonah first repaired what everyone else wanted to replace. The film cut. The screen showed the water wheel. One particular section near the axle. Jonah's hand. A repaired spoke, then black. For several seconds nobody in the hall spoke. The past had stopped feeling historical. It had just given them directions. Alden was already planning how to inspect the wheel when thunder rolled over North Haven. By the time he and Kepler reached White Cedar Range, rain was falling hard enough to blur the headlights. Naomi had warned that a strong autumn system was moving through the region. No one had expected it to strengthen so quickly. Water collected across the forest road. Branches moved violently overhead. The waterfall no longer sounded like the steady presence Alden had grown used to. It roared. He parked near the mill and ran toward the flume. Kepler stayed close. The diverted stream was carrying far too much water. The wheel spun faster than Alden had ever seen it. Old spokes blurred beneath the spray. The structure shuddered every time the paddles loaded. If the axle failed, several hundred pounds of wet timber and iron could twist loose toward the stone foundation. Alden climbed onto the upper maintenance platform and reached the diversion gate. It would not move. He pulled harder. Nothing. Years of mineral buildup and wood swelling had locked the mechanism. Come on. The wheel accelerated. Alden changed leverage. Kepler barked once, sharp, specific. Alden looked. The German shepherd stood on higher ground, head angled toward the support structure beneath him. A thin crack was running through one wet timber. Alden moved immediately. The beam split less than 2 seconds later. Part of the platform collapsed into the rushing water. Alden landed on one knee against stable rock. Kepler moved toward him but stopped when Alden raised a hand. I'm good. The dog remained tense. The diversion gate was now unreachable from that side. Alden needed another route. Then, faint beneath the storm, came a vehicle horn. Alden turned. Headlights flashed through the trees near the upper boundary trail. Someone was out there. He swore under his breath. Alden grabbed his rope bag from the truck. Kepler was already looking uphill. They followed the forest grade toward the sound. Half a mile away, they found a county utility vehicle blocked by a fallen spruce. A second tree had come down across the slope. 2 men were trapped between rising runoff channels. One was Calvin. The other wore a reflective county rain jacket. His name was Daniel Pike, a 46-year-old county surveyor Alden had seen once at the records office but never formally met. Daniel was tall and narrow-shouldered, around 6 feet, with a long, weathered face, sandy brown hair graying at the temples, a trimmed short beard, and pale green eyes. He had the careful, understated manner of a man whose profession depended on believing measurements more than personalities. At the moment, his left leg was pinned beneath a heavy branch. Blood darkened his trouser leg near the shin. Calvin was trying to lever the branch with a broken sapling. He looked up when Alden appeared. "Survey markers," Calvin shouted over the rain. "We were checking the northern boundary." Alden did not waste time asking why they had chosen today. He assessed Daniel, alert, breathing, no obvious head injury. Leg trapped, but the branch did not appear to be crushing the thigh. Alden knelt. "Daniel, I'm Alden. Stay still. I know who you are." "Good." Saves introductions. Even Daniel managed a strained breath that might have been a laugh. Alden checked circulation below the injury as well as conditions allowed. Then he looked toward the water. Runoff was rising fast between them and the safest road back. Behind Alden, far downhill, the watermill groaned. He could return. Try to save the wheel. Search for the certification. Protect the building before the axle tore loose. Or stay here. There was no real decision. Not for him. Property could wait. People could not. "Calvin, get the rope." Calvin stared at him for half a second, then obeyed. Alden built a basic mechanical advantage around 2 stable trees and used a second line to control the branch when they shifted it. Kepler moved along the edge of the runoff channel, testing ground and returning whenever the route narrowed. The German shepherd stopped twice before sections where water had undermined the leaves. Alden changed course both times. Not magic. Kepler could smell saturated soil, hear water moving beneath debris, and feel instability before a human boot committed weight. It was enough. They freed Daniel. His lower leg was badly bruised and cut, but he could put limited weight on it with support. Alden improvised a splint, then positioned Calvin on one side. "We go high." Calvin pointed toward the direct route. "Trucks that way. Water's that way too." Kepler was already climbing toward the ridge. Alden followed the dog. They moved slowly. Rain hammered the leaves. Daniel nearly slipped twice. Calvin's expensive field coat was coated in mud. Nobody cared. Halfway back, a deep cracking sound rolled through the forest. Not thunder, wood, then metal. Then one huge impact. Alden turned. Down through the trees, the water wheel stopped. Completely. The absence of its motion looked wrong even from a distance. One large spoke had broken. The outer rim had shifted. The watermill seemed to lean almost imperceptibly toward the stream. Calvin saw Alden staring. "You left it," he said. Alden looked at Daniel, then back at Calvin. "House can be repaired." Calvin said nothing. That sentence seemed to strike him harder than any argument Alden had made at the porch. They reached the cabin near dusk. Evelyn, Maggie, and Naomi had driven as far as the safe section of road after hearing about the storm. Emergency crews met them there and took Daniel for medical evaluation. Calvin remained beneath the porch roof, soaked and muddy. For once, he did not look toward the acreage. He looked at the damaged wheel. Then at Alden. "You could have stayed here." Alden removed his wet field jacket and wrung water from one sleeve. "Yes, you knew what that film showed, yes. The proof could have been in the wheel, could have." Calvin looked toward the road where Daniel had been taken. "And you still came?" Alden's eyes hardened slightly. "Don't make it complicated." Calvin's mouth opened, closed. For the first time since Alden had met him, Calvin Rusk had no negotiation ready. By morning, the rain had weakened. The waterfall remained high but stable. Alden approached the damaged wheel with Kepler. The broken spoke had exposed part of the inner hub that had been impossible to see before. Kepler moved immediately toward the axle, sniffed, backed away from dripping iron, returned, then focused on a rectangular plate partially hidden beneath old grease and mineral deposits. Alden cleaned it, 4 old screws. He removed them carefully. Behind the plate sat a narrow cylindrical cavity. Inside was brass. Alden pulled the container free, the same shape Silas had held in the film. His hands became suddenly careful. Naomi joined him at the workbench. Maggie stood nearby. The cylinder contained 4 items protected by waxed wrapping. The original Stillwater Trust certification, Silas's embossed seal, a deed attachment identifying the watermill as the anchor property, and one final letter. Naomi examined the paperwork without making claims she could not yet prove. "These appear consistent," she said, "but they still need formal authentication and county review." Alden nodded. He had expected nothing less. He opened Silas's letter. One paragraph mattered most. "If you found this, do not use it to protect the house from the world. Use it to open the house to those the world has forgotten." Alden folded the paper. For the first time, the certification did not feel like a weapon against Calvin. It felt like responsibility. The county hearing took place 11 days later. Naomi presented the archival chain. County council reviewed the original documents. Historical paper, seals, signatures, parcel descriptions, and previous filings were compared. The process was painfully ordinary. Alden appreciated that. Important things deserved verification. The community hall filled again. Evelyn spoke first. She did not deliver a grand speech. She told the board North Haven needed work, but that work did not have to erase everything that made North Haven worth staying in. Naomi explained Stillwater's historical significance. A middle-aged mechanic with oil permanently embedded in the lines of his hands said restoring small cabins would require tradespeople too. An elementary school teacher, a thin woman in her 50s with graying blonde hair, spoke about young families leaving the county. The hardware store owner pointed out that local construction projects bought local lumber, fasteners, tools, fuel, and food. Daniel Pike attended on crutches. His left leg was bandaged beneath loose trousers. He spoke only about the land. The original surveys aligned. The trust documentation was internally consistent. The anchor parcel was legitimate. Then Calvin stood. The room became quiet. He looked neither defeated nor transformed. He still wore the same dark navy field coat. He still looked like a developer, because he was one. "I think North Haven needs development," he said. Several people shifted. Calvin continued, "I still think that." Then he looked toward Alden. "Whitaker pulled me and Daniel out while I was trying to prove his property should be available for another use space." Alden's jaw tightened. Calvin went on. "He left the mill during the worst water I'd seen there in years." A pause. "Maybe I misunderstood which thing on that property was holding this town together." He did not apologize. He did something Alden respected more. He changed his position where it mattered. Calvin told the board he would not challenge the Stillwater anchor designation if the trust was validated. He would redirect his investors toward parcels farther from the watershed. The board voted. Stillwater's trust status was formally recognized. The acreage remained protected under its intended purpose, subject to modern safety, land use, and operational requirements. It was not complete victory. Alden would still need permits, funding, plans, inspections, a structure for Stillwater that worked in the present instead of worshiping the past. But the land would remain available for that work. When the meeting ended, people surrounded Alden. The mechanic offered help with the axle. The hardware store owner promised to find cedar at cost. The teacher wanted to know whether vocational students might eventually help. Evelyn simply handed Alden a paper bag. Food. Alden looked inside. Apple bread, of course. Maggie smiled. Naomi adjusted her glasses and said, "You appear to have accidentally acquired a community." Alden looked around the room. He was not comfortable with that sentence, which probably meant it was true. Later that night, he returned alone with Kepler to the watermill. The storm had washed the forest clean. Moonlight silvered the wet stones. The waterfall moved heavily behind the cabin, but the wheel did not. For the first time since Alden had come here, it stood completely still. One broken spoke hung at an angle. The damaged rim waited in silence. Alden walked to it, placed one hand against the wet wood. Kepler stood at his side, not ahead, not behind, beside him. Alden looked at the broken spoke. Months earlier, his first instinct would have been to calculate whether the structure was worth the effort. Weeks earlier, he might have decided to repair it alone. Tonight, he thought of the mechanic, the hardware store owner, Naomi, Evelyn, Maggie, even Calvin, somewhere in town rewriting a development plan. Alden rested his hand on Kepler's neck. "Tomorrow," he said, "we fix it." He stopped. A faint smile touched his face. "Not I. We." A year later, early autumn returned to white cedar range and gold. Paper birches burned yellow between the dark green of pine, cedar, and spruce. Ferns along the stream had begun to fade at their edges, while moss still covered the granite in thick, impossible green. Mist lifted from the waterfall every morning. When sunlight passed through it, the air behind the watermill filled with tiny drifting points of light. The cabin remained crooked. That mattered. Alden Cross Whitaker had never allowed the restoration to become a disguise. The weathered gray-brown cedar siding still carried decades of scars. Some boards had been replaced where rot threatened the structure, but whenever an old section remained strong enough to serve, Alden kept it. The porch had been rebuilt where necessary. The roof no longer leaked. The stone foundation had been stabilized. The flume had been strengthened. The windows closed tightly enough to keep winter outside. But the house did not look new. It looked cared for. There was a difference. Alden stood beside the water wheel one cool morning with a wrench in his right hand. He still wore the same olive-green field jacket, faded now in places where rain, sawdust, mud, and work had marked it over the year. Beneath it remained the red and deep navy plaid flannel shirt, dark green cargo pants, worn brown leather boots, and the old military field watch on his left wrist. His dark brown military-cut hair had a little more silver at the temples. The deep blue-gray eyes were still watchful, but not in quite the same way. There had once been a difference between Alden being still and Alden being at rest. Now the difference was smaller. Kepler sat several feet away. The German Shepherd had turned 8 during the summer. His medium-sized working frame remained lean and muscular, black saddle dark against the warm tan of his chest and legs, amber brown eyes clear and intelligent beneath naturally erect ears. The small old tear along the edge of his right ear remained unmistakable. A few pale hairs had appeared around his black muzzle. Not enough to make him look old. Enough to remind Alden that time moved even when a man finally stopped running from it. Kepler wore his faded dark olive working harness whenever people were around the property, though Alden removed it when they were alone. That morning, Kepler watched Alden examine the water wheel. One spoke stood out immediately. It was lighter than the others. Fresh cedar compared with the dark, water-aged wood surrounding it. The storm-damaged piece had been replaced months earlier by Alden, 2 local mechanics, and 3 men from the repair apprenticeship. Evelyn Mercer had asked more than once why he did not stain the new spoke darker. She asked again that morning as she crossed the footpath carrying a covered basket. At 71, Evelyn remained comfortably sturdy, with her softly rounded face, warm hazel eyes, fair skin marked by faint freckles and age, and silver-threaded light brown bob tucked neatly beneath one ear. She wore the same deep burgundy quilted barn vest over her cream and brown plaid flannel shirt, dark jeans, and tan ankle boots. She stopped beside Alden and nodded at the wheel. "You know they sell stain. I've heard rumors. You own brushes, several, and somehow that thing is still the color of a kitchen table." Alden tightened one bolt. "That's intentional." "Of course it is," Evelyn waited. Alden finally looked at the lighter spoke. "So we remember it broke." Her expression softened. She did not make the moment larger than it needed to be. That was one reason Alden trusted her. Evelyn simply nodded. Fair enough. Then she lifted the basket. I brought food. Alden looked toward Kepler. See? This is how it starts. You accept one loaf of bread and suddenly people think you require feeding. Evelyn walked past him. You do. Kepler followed her immediately. Alden stared after the dog. Traitor. The wheel turned behind him. Creak. A pause. Creak. The old sound remained, but it had changed. Or Alden had. Before, each groan sounded like a warning that the machine might fail. Now the rhythm was steady, not silent, not perfect. Alive, the restoration of the watermill had taken months. Restoring Stillwater had taken longer. Alden had learned that saving an idea required more paperwork than saving a collapsing porch. County permits, insurance, safety inspections, grant applications, legal restructuring, environmental surveys, budget meetings. He had discovered that there were threats more exhausting than gunfire. One of them was a 6-page application requiring the same date in 4 different boxes. Naomi Bell had laughed when he said that. You wanted community, she reminded him. I wanted 2 cabins. This is how civilization punishes optimism. Stillwater had not become a miracle. Alden insisted on that. After 1 year, there were not 24 new houses scattered through the forest. There were 2. Almost. One small cabin stood near completion on a rise west of the watermill, tucked among birch and cedar, where morning light entered through the trees. The second was farther north near a quiet clearing, roofed but still unfinished inside. A third foundation had only recently been marked with stakes and string. That was enough. One home at a time. One person at a time. Alden had refused every proposal that treated growth as proof of success. He had spent too much of his life around people who confused bigger with better. Stillwater's funding came from several small grants, private donations, local fundraising, and a modest preservation award Naomi helped secure. The labor came from a combination of professional tradespeople, vocational students, volunteers, and a repair apprenticeship Alden had organized with help from North Haven businesses. Some apprentices were veterans. Others were simply local men and women who wanted practical skills. Alden did not care which story had brought someone through the gate. He cared whether they showed up. The apprenticeship paid small stipends when funding allowed and partnered with local contractors for additional work. It did not employ 80 people. Calvin Rusk had once used that number as a weapon. Alden remembered. Stillwater employed 6 people regularly now, supported several local trades on contract, and purchased much of its material in or near North Haven. Small numbers, real numbers. The hardware store sold more lumber. The diner saw more breakfast customers. A local carpenter hired one apprentice full-time after watching her work on the first cabin. Alden did not pretend Stillwater had saved North Haven's economy, but it had proven something he had once only hoped. Preserving land and creating economic value did not have to cancel each other out. Calvin noticed, too, they were not friends. That also mattered. Some stories made every disagreement end in a handshake under perfect sunlight. Real people were less convenient. Calvin was still a developer. He still arrived at county meetings with plans Alden disliked. Alden still looked at some of Calvin's proposed roads and asked whether he was attempting to personally offend trees. Calvin still replied that trees did not vote. But when Calvin submitted a new development proposal the following spring, the project map avoided the Stillwater watershed entirely. Alden noticed. He did not thank him. Calvin did not ask. That was probably as close to friendship as either man required. The hidden workshop had changed the least. Naomi insisted on that. Original Stillwater blueprints remained in archival storage inside the watermill under controlled conditions as much as the old building allowed. Digital copies had been made. High-resolution scans were available to researchers. Silas's drafting table stayed where it had always been. His faded brown canvas work jacket remained on the wooden peg. The old tools stayed arranged along the wall. Once a month, a small group of architecture students or vocational students came to study the designs. Naomi required them to clean their hands. Alden required them not to lean on anything that looked expensive. Naomi informed him that historically important and expensive were not the same thing. Alden informed her that his rule was easier to remember. The second chair remained beside Silas's drafting table. It was still plain, still wooden, still intentionally there, but it was no longer always empty. That changed more than Alden expected. Sometimes Naomi sat there while reviewing records. Sometimes Evelyn sat there when she brought lunch and decided Alden had been alone long enough. Sometimes one of the local mechanics took the chair while discussing an axle repair. Once, Alden had found Maggie sitting there by herself with one hand resting on the table. pale blue eyes fixed on Silas's old jacket. He had quietly left her alone. There were different kinds of privacy. He was learning that too. Dedication day arrived in late September. Alden disliked the phrase. It sounded too much like something involving a ribbon, a microphone, and speeches by people who had never touched a hammer. Unfortunately, Naomi had arranged all three. By 10 in the morning, people filled the clearing around the watermill. Not hundreds, dozens, enough. Local tradespeople, students, neighbors, a few county officials, families, people who had once laughed about the man who bought the ruined mill for $1. Some now stood beneath the trees holding coffee and admiring the same crooked building they had expected winter to destroy. Alden found that amusing. He found their presence unexpectedly moving. He preferred amusing. Maggie Bellwether arrived shortly before the short ceremony began. At 79 now, she moved more slowly than she had the previous autumn. The small woman still wore her weathered sage-green canvas barn jacket over a cream cardigan and ivory blouse, dark brown trousers, and brown walking shoes. Her silver-white hair remained gathered in a low bun. A small brass key ring hung from one hand. She used no cane, though Alden noticed she chose the flatter side of the path. He walked down to meet her. "You could have called and missed seeing whether you'd fixed the road." "I didn't. I noticed." Alden offered an arm. Maggie looked at it, then at him. "Are you being polite? Trying something new? Dangerous?" She took his arm anyway. Kepler approached them from the porch. His gait remained strong, though rising after a long rest took him a little longer than it had a year earlier. Maggie bent only slightly and allowed the German shepherd to come the rest of the way. Kepler sniffed her fingers. His tail gave one slow movement. "You remember me," she said. Alden glanced at the dog. "He remembers people who sell him real estate." Maggie smiled. The ceremony itself was brief. Alden had insisted. Naomi spoke about Silas and Jonah. A county representative spoke about preservation. Evelyn refused to speak and instead organized food, which Alden believed demonstrated superior judgment. The Stillwater sign near the path was uncovered. Simple cedar, nothing polished. No slogan larger than the name. Applause moved through the trees. Alden stood off to one side. He was more comfortable there. Then Maggie appeared beside him. For a while neither spoke. The waterfall filled the space. Finally Alden asked the question he had carried for almost a year. "Why me?" Maggie's pale blue eyes turned toward him. "I didn't choose you immediately." Alden frowned. "You made me drive 8 miles into the woods as an interview. 8.5. You counted?" "I worked in county records for 40 years. Of course you counted." Maggie smiled. Alden looked toward the mill. "You turned down other buyers?" "Yes." "Some offered real money?" "Yes." "And you still let me buy it for $1? "Yes." Alden waited. Maggie seemed to enjoy making him do that. "You weren't the first veteran who called," she said. "I assumed not. You weren't the poorest. That hurts. You weren't even the most polite." "That I believe." She looked toward Kepler lying beneath the porch railing. Then she returned her attention to Alden. "I listened to the first thing people asked." Alden said nothing. Most asked how much land came with the property. Others had asked about timber rights, development access, waterfront, resale, tourism. Alden tried to remember his own call. Maggie helped him. "You asked whether the house was still livable." Something in Alden became quiet. Maggie continued. "You didn't ask what it might be worth after repairs." She looked toward the crooked old cabin. "You asked whether someone could still live inside it." Alden swallowed. That's why I let you come look." He glanced toward Kepler. "And the sale?" Maggie's smile deepened. "The dog handled that part." Alden looked toward the porch. Kepler occupied almost the exact patch of boards where he had settled the first afternoon. The boards themselves were newer now. The position was not. Alden remembered believing the dog had refused a simple command for no reason. But Maggie shook her head before he could say anything. "Don't make it mystical," she said. Alden looked at her, surprised. "You're telling me that? I've been misunderstood for years." She nodded toward the waterfall. Maybe he liked the water, maybe the smell, maybe the soft ground. Maybe the sound made sense to him. Kepler rested his head between his paws. Maggie continued. "Animals don't have to understand destiny to recognize peace." Alden felt the words settle. That was better than magic, far better, because it meant Kepler had not found some enchanted house. He had simply recognized something Alden had forgotten how to recognize. A place where neither of them needed to remain ready to leave. And for a man who once trusted that dog with his life, perhaps he should not have been surprised that Kepler had recognized home first. The dedication ended without ceremony, becoming unbearable. People drifted toward the new cabin site. Students asked Naomi questions. Tradespeople compared the replacement roof work with the original construction. Evelyn made Alden eat. Calvin arrived late. He stayed near the road, dark navy waxed coat buttoned against the breeze. Alden saw him speaking to a county official beside a new watershed map. Their eyes met. Calvin nodded once. Alden returned it. Nothing more. By late afternoon, the crowd began to thin. Maggie left with Naomi. The students packed equipment. Evelyn collected serving dishes. Before leaving, she sat for several minutes in the second chair inside Silas's workshop. Not for any symbolic reason, she announced. Her feet hurt. That was Evelyn's explanation. Alden accepted it. Symbolism did not always need cooperation. Eventually, the final truck disappeared beyond the trees. Silence returned. Not true silence. Water, wind, the steady wooden movement of the wheel. Alden sat on the porch. The second chair had been brought outside for the ceremony. It remained beside him, empty now, but different from before. Once, an empty chair had looked like proof no one belonged there. Now it simply meant someone had gotten up and might return. Kepler crossed the porch slowly. The 8-year-old German shepherd turned once before lowering himself beside Alden. A few pale hairs around his muzzle caught the golden light. He placed his head across Alden's boot. Alden rested one hand between the dog's ears. The wheel turned. Creak. Water fell. Mist moved through sunlight. Alden looked toward the pale replacement spoke. 1 year earlier, he would have looked at the difference in color and seen failure. Something broken. Something replaced because the original had not survived. Now he saw continuity. The wheel was not weaker because one spoke told the truth. The watermill was not ruined because some siding had been replaced. Kepler was not less of the dog he had been because silver had begun to appear around his muzzle. And Alden had spent too long believing damage reduced a man's value. Silas had written something Alden finally understood without needing to read it again. Never replace what can still carry weight. The phrase had seemed to be about beams. Then Jonah. Then the water wheel. Only much later had Alden realized how much he needed it to be about himself. He remembered the man who had first walked into this clearing. No permanent address. Debt following him. 6 boxes. A failing pickup. An old field jacket. A German shepherd whose best working years were behind him. From a distance, none of it looked like a beginning. Maybe that was why people laughed. People were accustomed to beginnings looking new. Fresh paint. Straight lumber. Clean clothes. Money in the bank. Confidence. But perhaps some of the most important beginnings looked like damaged things refusing to collapse. Alden scratched behind Kepler's torn ear. You knew before I did. Kepler opened one amber eye. Alden nodded. Annoying. The eye closed again. Alden smiled. The expression came more easily now. Not constantly. He had not transformed into a man who greeted mornings with inspirational thoughts. Evelyn still claimed he could make good morning sound like a threat. But there were people he expected to see next week. Plans extending into next spring, a foundation waiting for concrete, a cabin needing windows, students scheduled to return, a county meeting he planned to argue at, small commitments, ordinary ones. They were the architecture of staying. Alden looked through the trees toward the first new Stillwater cabin. Someone would eventually live there. Not forever, probably. That was never the promise. The promise was time. Enough safety to rest, enough dignity to choose, enough help without being reduced to helplessness. A bridge between survival and whatever came after. Silas had started with Jonah. Alden had started with Kepler. Maybe most good things began smaller than people expected. The waterfall flashed white beneath the lowering sun. Mist moved around the moss-covered stones. The old watermill stood exactly where everyone once believed it should not. Still slightly crooked, still weathered, still bearing scars, but solid. The wheel continued its slow rotation. The new spoke disappeared beneath the flume water and returned shining. Alden thought about the first thing he had wanted from the property. No landlord. No notice taped to a door. No one capable of telling him he had 72 hours to disappear. He had believed home meant owning a place nobody could take away. He knew better now. Home was not the place where no one could force a man to leave. Home was the place where the man finally stopped preparing to. Alden leaned back against the cedar post. Kepler's head remained on his boot. The old military watch on Alden's wrist ticked beneath the cuff of his olive field jacket. For once, he did not check it. There was nowhere else he needed to be. People had laughed when Alden Cross Whitaker bought a ruined watermill for $1. They thought he had bought rotten wood, a failing wheel, and a roof that would not survive winter. They had been wrong. But not because treasure had been hidden inside the walls. Not because the land was valuable. Not because Silas North had left behind important papers. The real value had been quieter. Alden had bought himself a reason to remain long enough for other people to find him, and Kepler, The old German shepherd, resting peacefully at his feet, had understood that before he did. The water wheel turned. Creak, creak, creak. And this time, nothing in the sound suggested something dying. It sounded like something continuing. Sometimes the miracle we pray for does not arrive as a sudden answer from heaven. Sometimes it comes quietly. It looks like an old house everyone else has given up on. It sounds like a broken water wheel turning one more time. It feels like the steady presence of a faithful dog who somehow knows where peace is hiding before we do. Alden thought he needed a place no one could take away from him. What he really needed was a reason to stop running. And perhaps that is how God works in many of our lives. He does not always remove every scar. He does not always rebuild everything overnight. Sometimes he simply places the right person, the right animal, the right opportunity, or the right open door in our path and asks us to trust him enough to take one more step. There may be seasons when life makes us feel like that old watermill, weathered, damaged, forgotten, and no longer useful. But being scarred does not mean being finished. Being tired does not mean being defeated. And being broken in one place does not erase everything in us that can still carry weight. Maybe the miracle is not that God makes us exactly who we were before the pain. Maybe the miracle is that he shows us we can still become someone meaningful after it. In everyday life, we may never discover secret rooms or buy a forgotten house for $1, but all of us will eventually face something that seems beyond repair. A relationship, a dream, our confidence, our sense of purpose, or simply our belief that tomorrow can be better than today. When that happens, remember the old wheel. Sometimes we do not need to replace our whole life. Sometimes we need to repair one spoke, take one honest step, accept one helping hand, offer forgiveness once, call someone we have been avoiding, stay one more day, pray one more prayer, and trust that God may still be working in places we cannot yet see. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need a little hope today, and tell us in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment when something that first looked like a setback later felt like God was quietly guiding you toward a different path? Your story may be exactly what another person reading the comments needs to hear. If you believe stories about courage, loyalty, second chances, and the extraordinary bond between people and dogs still matter, please subscribe to K9 Navy SEAL Stories and join us for the next journey. Thank you for spending this time with us. May God bless you, protect your family, give strength to those carrying burdens no one else can see, bring comfort to anyone walking through loss, and guide each of us toward the place where our hearts can finally find peace. And wherever your road leads next, may you never forget this. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not finding a new life. It is discovering that the life you thought was broken still has something beautiful left to give.